Good morning, everyone. I'm Nicole Yacoub. I'm the Director of Admissions for the USC Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work, and I want to welcome you to the Next Generation Social Work Conference. Thank you for joining us this morning. We are thrilled to have some of the top experts in the addiction science space here with us today, and we hope that by the end of the conference, you will have a clear understanding of what is possible for social workers within the transdisciplinary research and practice of addiction science. This is an interactive conference, so we will have an opportunity for you to submit questions for the speakers to answer through the Q&A platform in each session. It's located in the navigation bar at the bottom of your screen. And we look forward to meeting all of you during our Meet the Schools Fair to connect with representatives from leading schools of social work from around the country about MSW programs and professional development opportunities. Once again, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the conference. I am pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Olivia Lee, an assistant professor at the USC Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work. Dr. Lee seeks to disentangle a complex relationship among socioeconomic status, adverse childhood experiences, and behavior health, particularly substance abuse and its comorbid mental health during the life course and across generations. Please welcome Dr. Lee.
Hi, I'm Olivia Lee. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really thrilled to be here. And I will open up this conference, Next Generation Social Work Conferences. Next slide, please. And today in my little talk, we'll talk about the three things. The first one is the scope of addiction problems in the United States. And the second one is a social work approach. My take on what is a social work approach to addiction problems. And the third one is a couple of example studies, and then we'll have a Q&A. Next slide, please. So the first one, we'll talk about the scope of addiction problems. Next slide, please. This one is from National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which we often call as NGSW. And NGSW is a national surveillance data source showing where the nation stands in terms of drug use. This one is a 2018 the data source. If we will look at this one, alcohol problem, 80% of US population age 12 or older say they're involved in alcohol. And I want to point out the cigarette use. This one is often called as a #1 killer in terms of substance use problems. About 55% of the United States, the population say they're using cigarette to some degree. And also illicit drug use, 50% of the population in our country say they have used illicit drugs, one type or the other. This one is showing us substance use problems are quite prevalent in our society. Next slide, please. And now this one is we are looking at specifically youth. In a previous slide, we have looked at the scope of addiction problem in our nation at the population level. And we learned that it is a quite prevalent problems in our nation, in our country. And when we look at the youth, that prevalence, the high prevalence is not going away. If you like, let's point out, I'm gonna point out a couple numbers here. 8th grader, about 20% 8th graders say they have used alcohol. And if we move the 12th grader, they say about 40% of 12th graders say they have used some sort of illicit drug use. So again, this one is telling us it's quite prevalent. Substance use problems are quite prevalent in the population and the youth as well. Next slide, please. So the consequences of such prevalent substance use are literally fatal. Thousands of Americans have lost their lives in relation to overdose the drug overdose. The trend is just showing an increasing pattern. In 1999, it's under 20,000 people lost their lives related to drug overdose. But in 2019, now we have over 70,000 people, their lives due to drug overdose. So this one is telling us is the underscore the importance of understanding the substance use problem and do something about it so that we can protect the public's the life. Next slide, please. Then the next question that we're going to wrestle with, how social work approaches this problem. This is a really highly prevalent substance use problem. Are there any uniqueness to social work approaches? That is the question that we're going to navigate together next. Next slide, please. If we ask this question, what is the unique features of a social work approach to the addiction problem? You may get a slightly different answers from different people. This is my take on, based on my observation, what are the kind of key characteristics that I see in our social work approach to addiction, the problems. I would say there are 4 key characteristics. The first one is a social justice, and the second one is a life course perspective, and the third one is ecological perspective, and the final one is prevention to treatment. So I'm gonna have the brief comment about each one. Next slide, please. The first one is a social justice. This is the first and the foremost important aspect that social workers bring to the table of solving addiction problems. That is a really social justice. We are disciplined that we anchor ourselves within this value of a social justice. It is incredibly tricky to define what a social justice really means, but it's the simplest term we can define in a way, fairness in the way that people are dealt with. And particularly to me, and based on, again, my observation, we social workers constantly reflect on one critical aspect of social justice, which is distributional justice. And again, it's defined, what is the definition? It is tricky, but a definition is like this: to what society owes the person regarding the distribution of societal resources. If we apply this notion of social justice to addiction problem, this can be translated into disparities in stages of addiction problems and the recovery. Vulnerable members of our society experience more addiction problems, more limited access to services when they have addiction problems, and do not have resources to maintain addiction-free stages. So that's where the social workers coming in. We are wrestling with this disparity and inequality in addiction problem and a recovery. Next slide, please. And then where the vulnerability coming from? The vulnerable members, I mentioned that one. Reflecting on various groups of socioeconomic identities will help us get more concrete sense about it. Having a membership to a certain social group, for example, being born to low-resourced families, may increase kiddos' probability to get more exposed to drug use problems in their own families or their neighborhood. So that's the one, how we're gonna get at this disparity, the issues. Next slide, please. Next two are there related in my head. I'm gonna talk about life course perspective and ecological perspective. Next slide, please. So life course perspective, in essentially, when we see anyone's substance use problem, the clients who are struggling with a substance use problem in front of us, we are seeking to see the connection from childhood across the life course, not just isolate that moment. We are looking at connection and whole kind of thing. What happened in earlier developmental stages will have implications for later substance use problem. For example, we may work with the clients, young adult client, who is struggling with drug problems. One of the reasons might be why the client is struggling with a drug problem is potentially related to childhood adversity that they experienced as a child. Then our approach, how we're going to solve and help this client will need to be trauma informed. Next slide, please. Ecological perspective is now we are contextualize the one's life course, how that substance use problem, drug addiction problems are coming out within the higher ecological context. We're thinking about family connection. We're thinking about peer influences. We're thinking about school. Do we have resources and a whole kind of thing at the school or the community level? Or in a society, at the society level and a policy and whole things like that. Next slide, please. Final pillar in my head and our social work approach is the working toward not just the treatment, but toward prevention as well. So given that we're anchoring our approach to the addiction from the life course perspective, we're helping clients who are suffering with a substance use problem right now at the moment, but also we have our eyes on how to prevent substance use problem from happening from the get-go. Next slide, please. We can move on to next one, please. So we talk about the 4 pillars of the approach, social work approach to the addiction problems. 4 different ones. And now I want to give you a couple of examples how that can be really actualized in a study, in a social work, the science toward the addiction problems. Next slide, please. We can move on to next one. Okay, here, this is one of the studies that I have led. Here I'm looking at unemployment and childhood poverty and young adult substance use problem. In this study, what we have really looking at, and we talk about at the beginning when I was talking about the pillars, the characteristics of our social work approach to addiction problem, I talk about the vulnerability, the disadvantaged, the population. Here I am looking at low socioeconomic status. Employment status is one of the key characteristics, key feature of socioeconomic status. And then I'm linking current young adults' unemployment to their childhood, childhood poverty. So the accumulation of that disadvantage, from a perspective of socioeconomic status, how the one is influenced on current young adult substance use problem. Next slide, please. And what we have found in the study is that my unemployment status as a young adult has the influence on my substance use problem. But if I'm coming from low resource family, if I spend my childhood low income and poverty, then they will have bigger impact on my substance use problem. Next slide, please. This is from a perspective, ecological perspective. I talk about when you're thinking about substance use problem, we're connecting the different ecological domain. This one is specifically connecting the family. Next slide, please. So here, what we have done, what I have looking, and this one is led by my colleague Julie Sitterbaum. She's the faculty member at our school as well. We have looking at the relationship from G1's substance use that has impact on G2's substance use and a whole mechanism in there. And a G2's substance use has impact on G3's substance use, specifically cannabis use. Those are the few examples of how that characteristic of the social work approach to addiction problem can be actualized, at least in my head. Alrighty, that's it. That's what I have. And then any questions or anything, I love to have a conversation. Alrighty, I'm gonna looking it up here, the chat box. Give me. what has surprised me, what are really the interesting and exciting question. So what has surprised me is two things. One is that the connection, the addiction problem is not like isolated, standing alone, it's not like that. But the addiction problem is really interconnected with this disparity. And what is going on, this social, the social inequality, what is going on, that one really has influence on this addiction problem. That was one thing. And the other one is when we are working on addiction problem, even though as a social workers, we have a unique perspectives and everything, we got to work as a team that transdisciplinary. We need the psychologists, we need a pharmacist, we need the doctors and nurses and whole thing and working together. That's another one that has surprised me. Okay, I'm going to move on to next one. Social work such a, I'm going to read these questions. I don't know, you can see all the question. Next question I see is, what do you think makes a social work such an important part of transdisciplinary approach of addiction science? That one is, to me, is a social justice. We bring the social justice perspective to the table. And we also bring this broader perspective, not just isolated individual, like separately, but looking at it holistically. And also the other one is looking at the influences that can come from different ecological domain, like families and peers and the schools and everything. That's another one I would say is a really important part of transdisciplinary team to the addiction science. Next question is, again, I'm going to read it just in case you cannot see it. If someone was interested in focusing their career in addiction science, where should they start? What an excellent question. What you can do is that the studying, like understanding what is the scope of problems and a whole kind of thing. But the other one that since we're talking about social work, the other one is, I would say, you go out in the field as a volunteer and see what is going on out there. And then that's going to give you a lot of fresh perspective, and you will see what is unmet service needs out there in the field. And then when you come to the school and to learn about this substance use problem and what are the factors feeding into substance use problem and a whole kind of thing, then will click really well for you. And then it will be kind of the two-way learning. You learn what is going out there in the field, but also you learn what is academically we know about these addiction problems. Okay, so next question is, how much would customizing addiction treatment and recovery problems improve sustainable outcomes for individuals with substance use disorders? That's yet another really the interesting and important question. Customizing and tailoring the addiction treatment and recovery program is absolutely important, because we know as a social workers, we know there is a foundation, there is evidence-based practice. Absolutely, we want to navigate and thinking which one has been proven, has shown evidence that this one is actually working, though or not. We can have that one, but at the same time, each individual, the people are so different from each other, so that you don't want to saying that this one thing is going to fit everybody, and this one can help everyone. We don't want to assume that absolutely. So we definitely want to customize in a way, is tailored in a way that is working for the specific, the individuals. Okay, if you have any more questions, please chime in. I love to hear or comments or anything. I love to have this one to be more interactive as much as we can. Where do you see the greatest promise in addiction science? This is really big question. Greatest promise in addiction science. I would say I see the one in many different domains. I don't know, I can pinpoint which one is the greatest promise in addiction science. But what we can see is that where we're going, this addiction is going, is the more holistic approach, not isolate a single one or a single aspect from the individual situation or nothing like that, but more like a holistic approach and looking at where we are going and where this problem is coming from and the whole thing. One thing that I want to mention is that in a recent addiction science and what is happening in treatment and prevention and whole thing, one thing that I see a lot is a trauma informed. Since as a social workers, we know we have worked with a lot of clients who have a lot of trauma, either as a little one or as a growing up, there is accumulation of a trauma. So because of the accumulation of a trauma, that can have triggered the substance use problem. So I think addiction science are moving toward like incorporate that trauma aspect in it so that we can navigate and we can tailor this existing intervention strategy more and stronger and more effective for clients that we're looking at, where we're working with. Alrighty, next one is, how did you get into social work and how did you come across the discipline of addiction science? And it's another good question. Okay, how did I get into social work? That is a kind of going back to one of our question about what I would recommend for you to start, where to start when you are interested in addiction, the problems in addiction science. Is the way that I started is I worked as a social workers. And before I worked as a social workers, I volunteered and I did a social work intern and a whole kind of thing. And then you see what is out there, what is going on, and a whole stuff. And one of the things stuck in my mind as while I was working with my client is that this notion of substance use, people are using a drug, and because of that, they are poor. That I am simplified that discourse this way, but there is that essentially what they have, either substance use problem or the low socioeconomic status, low income, losing their job, and the whole thing is because of they're using so much drug, and they're using so much drug, so they're losing their job, and because of that, their socioeconomic status is getting lower, and because of that, their children are suffering. And then in the field, I see that is not the case. It is really not the case. Our clients and my clients, when I work with them, they're doing their really best. And they're trying to make it work and a whole kind of thing. And the substance use problem, we cannot say that substance use problem is the source of their low income or whatsoever. It is more the other way around. So I want to fight against that notion that people using a lot of drug and because of that, they're falling into poverty. I want to fight against the notion. And that's why that I got into the social work, because as I say, social work is the notion of that the anchoring point of social justice, and then fighting against the stigma around the substance use and the relationship between the substance use and the socioeconomic status. That one. That's how got into the social work. And how did I come across the discipline of addiction science is because I have that one in my heart. When I entered the NGSW, I was seeking the opportunity. I was looking for the opportunity. And after I got my PhD, I was at the research center as a researcher. And then research center, we had a lot of substance use related. The study is going on, or intervention strategies are going on, and a whole kind of thing. So that one was that's how I come across the discipline of addiction science. And as I get into more and more into the addiction problem, I started collaborating with many people, many disciplines, as I said, across many disciplines. That's how I ended up being here. Okay, how is addiction science different from substance abuse? Okay, so addiction science and substance abuse. Addiction science, I would say, is include substance abuse. Addiction science, in a sense, is that trying to solve the substance abuse problem and drug addiction problem. So substance abuse, the word abuse, and addiction, they're not exchangeable, but at the same time, they're definitely related to each other. Okay, we have 3 minutes. Oh, there's one more question. What advice would you give for someone looking to get started within addiction science? So that my suggestion would be really you want to go out in the field. That will be the first one. And coming to the conferences like this or out there, there's many conferences and the information out there, there will be the good one as well. So that you see what is up, what is the unique approach and a whole kind of stuff. The other one is I would really, really encourage you to go out in the field. If you are in the MSW program currently, then when you're looking for internship, seeking out the internship with an emphasis on the substance use problem. And if you are not pre-MSW and just entertaining, navigating the different options and whole kind of thing, then I would say go out and volunteer and the different social work agency so that you can get exposure. So two-pronged, I guess, in a sense. One is go out really in the field, work with the clients, get experience, trying to understand their life, that one. And the other one is that the going out to conferences, and there's many other conferences which has a lot of emphasis on the substance use. So going out and seeking out those conferences. Alrighty, so I think we have 2 minutes left. Let me see if there's any other question. Okay, so I'm gonna wrap it up. Looks like that we're good. So I'm gonna wrap it up. Thank you so much. It's I love to see your face. It is interesting to I'm just behind somewhere. You are there, and someday hopefully I can meet you. The addiction science definitely needs you, who is passionate about the social justice and the disparity and a whole kind of angle. And hopefully this one gave you my talk and this conversation Q&A gave you idea what is the addiction science specifically within the context of the social work, what is the unique characteristics that we navigate as a social worker in relation to the substance use problem and addiction problems. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My name should be at the school, the website. Anyhow, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this opportunity to connect with you via online. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for sharing with us and having such an engaging conversation. For now, I'd like to introduce our first keynote speaker for the conference, Dr. John Clapp, who will be speaking about the future of addiction science, opportunities for social work. Dr. Clapp is the Executive Vice Dean and Professor at the USC Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work and an international expert in the field of alcohol problem prevention. He's a Fellow of the American Academy of Health Behavior and co-director of the USC Institute for Addiction Science. Welcome, Dr. Clapp.
Good morning, everyone. I'm John Clapp, and I'm here to talk to you today about the future of addiction science and opportunities for social work within addiction science. Glad to be here today. So what I'd like to start off with is a little bit of history about addiction science. Addiction science as a concept is actually a relatively new kind of phenomenon. We've had people studying addiction for a number of years. But it's traditionally been a mishmash of topics and disciplines working around specific issues. Those disciplines include social work, public health, medicine, pharmacy, psychology, sociology, all on the science side. And then you have law enforcement, criminal justice, psychiatry on the treatment side of things. But so there's been a number of different academic and professional disciplines looking at addiction, but never really in a framework that was coherent. That's starting to change now, and that's what I'd like to talk a little bit about today. The history of addiction science is really rooted in alcohol and drug research, and then following kind of substance abuse research, you'd have tobacco related research, sexual addictions, food addictions, and eating disorders. There's people that study caffeine and gambling addiction. And most recently, there's a whole host of addiction studies around technology. And this would include things like social media addiction, gaming addiction, you name it, anything that's really related to a technological device, a phone, etc. So that's a whole new emerging area of addiction science. But traditionally, these concepts that we use in addiction science have come out of research conducted by social and health scientists on alcohol, drugs, and tobacco, and then extending out to these other topics. The theories that we use to explain addiction and addictive behaviors have largely been isolated within disciplines, which what that basically means is social workers would approach it one way, psychologists would approach it another way, pharmacologists would approach it another way, and so on. And so you never really had an integrated theory, so to speak, of addiction. So how is this changing? How is addiction science moving forward to become its own new field? And I'd like to use the USC Addiction Science Institute for Addiction Science as an example of that, and talk a little bit about that, and then move on to talk a little bit about how social work fits into all this. So a couple years ago, a colleague of mine in preventive medicine, Adam Leventhal, started the Institute for Addiction Science along with myself and a couple other researchers. It initially was a collaboration between preventive medicine, social work, and pharmacy. And we are still the kind of the prime players in that. However, right now, the people working on the Institute represent almost every college and school at USC. So we have psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, psychiatrists, et cetera, working alongside public health folks and pharmacists and social workers to really come up with a comprehensive and integrated way of looking at addiction, creating an addiction science, if you will. Similar to the mission of academics at most universities and most certainly at USC, we are focusing on science, education, and service. On the science side, we're really working on integrated studies that look at addiction behavior from a holistic kind of perspective in a multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary perspective, where we're working together in groups of diverse scientists to really get at complex problems around addiction, both in terms of the etiology of addiction, why addiction occurs, and the prevention and treatment of addiction. We're also offering educational programs, and these are going to range from, kind of local programs here at USC designed for our own students to community educational programs for the population in Los Angeles. And then we're going to eventually expand beyond that to professional education, including a master's degree of addiction science, which we're working on currently and hope to launch very soon. In addition to that, we offer service opportunities. We're specifically really hoping to have an impact on the Los Angeles community around addiction. But as the Institute grows, we're hoping to move on to impact the state, the country, and finally move on to a global stage to address addiction. We're really interested here in developing what's called a transdisciplinary approach. And another way that people talk about transdisciplinary approaches is this idea of cells to society. And basically that means if you think about how people engage in addiction and addictive behaviors, that they have factors within themselves, whether they're genetic or it's brain chemistry or neuro functioning and so on, kind of things down at the cellular level that impact that, all the way through their motivations and expectancies and psychological factors, their social network and peer influence, their family, all the way up to the community they live in and the laws and policies that govern the substances and things that people get addicted to. And so this comprehensive approach, the cells to society approach, really tries to look at that problem at each of those levels of abstraction to come up with both a cogent explanation of how things work and why they happen the way they happen, but to identify strategic places to actually intervene through treatment and prevention to alleviate some of the problems that are associated with addiction. Beyond the traditional partners that I mentioned earlier, this is some exciting work is being done now where we're engaging people that might normally not be engaged in our efforts. Specifically, we've been working with people in engineering and computer science to use some of the research technologies and methodologies that they use and apply them to addiction to be able to answer some of these more complex problems that relate to this kind of idea of cells to society. All right, so how does social work fit into all this? So I'll start off by saying social work has really had a long history in the field of substance abuse, okay, or alcohol and other drugs, both in terms of prevention and treatment. And there are a number of social work researchers around the country working on these sorts of problems. And to a lesser degree, you'll find some social work researchers working on eating disorders or food addiction, sexual addiction, and gambling. And there's actually a couple people right now working on technology related addiction. But social work has been a player in this for quite some time. It also remains one of the more stable employment opportunities for social workers. So if you're interested in working in the social work field, in working in some way with addiction, there's a number of different opportunities out there, ranging from primary prevention. Not uncommon to find social workers working at county public health departments, working on primary prevention programs or school systems, all the way through treatment centers and recovery prevention programs. So we really have the full gamut of employment opportunities in social work around addiction and addiction science related areas. Even if you're not necessarily interested in working in the addiction field per se, Almost every problem that we deal with in social work is somehow impacted by addiction or addiction related issues. And so, whether you want to work in child welfare or in aging or be a military social work, the types of things that we'll discover through our work at the Institute and our work on addiction science will hopefully inform practice in those areas as well as we move forward. So again, a lot of opportunities here to be involved, both as a student, as a researcher, as a practitioner in the field of addiction, if you're a social work trained professional. Okay, so what's our specific role in addiction science? One of the things that's really important as we think about this cells to society perspective is that we have been long a leader in the social ecological perspective. So social work tends to look at problems from a systems perspective or a social ecological perspective, biopsychosocial perspective. There's a lot of different ways we talk about this, but it's the idea that different levels of abstraction all work together to influence behavior. They create environments that create social social problems, and at the same time that you have to intervene on all those different levels somewhat strategically and purposefully to solve these more complex problems. So that kind of perspective that we have as social workers brings a lot to the table when we're talking about addiction science. The other piece that I think is going to be critical is that social workers have long been champions of disparities research in the alcohol and drug field. In other words, we've kind of carried the torch professionally, not exclusively, because people in public health are interested in this as well in other fields, but we've really kind of carried the torch as far as social justice goes as it's related to alcohol and drug issues. And as we move forward in a more complex and diverse society, this will become increasingly important. So, you know, the ecological approach, our commitment to social justice and diversity. And now you're starting to see, interestingly enough, that some of these new partnerships that I spoke of earlier, where we're using the combination of engineers and computer scientists working with social work researchers, have been facilitated by our approach being somewhat similar, at least conceptually, to the way engineers and computer scientists approach problems from this more complex systems perspective. Some examples of this are machine learning and treatment. We have people in the school that are, including myself and Jordan Davis, that are working on papers related to this and studies related to treatment outcomes, machine learning and substance abuse patterns. You have Eric Rice working on social networks and social dynamics around behavior among homeless youth that crosses over into the addiction field. And some of the work I've done, and I'm going to show you in a minute, with engineers, we're looking at the system dynamics of alcohol and other drug problems. And so we've kind of carved out a unique place for ourselves where we come to the table with a long tradition of doing this, but are partnering with some non-traditional partners to really dig in and try to come up with creative solutions to problems that have been traditionally very hard to solve. So let's give an example, and this is an example from my own work. So I started looking at alcohol prevention at the event level. And basically what that means is we were interested in preventing the kinds of problems that happen when people are intoxicated. And this can range from drunk driving to assaults, to sexual assaults, to accidents, other accidents, falls, etc., fires. And that was the area I was interested in working. I've been working in that for a number of years. So a few years ago, we started working on the idea that you could use the principles used in computer science and engineering, along with existing social ecological theory and social work, and what was already out there in the evidence about what works, combine those in an integrated framework and come up with smart interventions. And when I'm talking about smart interventions, in this case, I'm actually talking about real-time interventions, or sometimes called just-in-time interventions, that are designed to intervene in real time during an event to bump people from a trajectory that might be problematic to a trajectory that is somewhat safer. Now, when I was working on this prior to working with the engineers, this was the basic model that I used. And you can kind of see the ecological levels here. We have person, environment, intoxication, proximal outcomes. And on the person level, you have behavioral outcomes or behavioral factors, psychological factors, demographic factors. We looked at some genetic factors earlier in my work. The environment, we're talking about the social attributes of an environment, the physical or built environment, et cetera. And then intoxication was measured through breathalyzers and self-reports. And then we had certain proximal outcomes that we were looking at, or acute outcomes, including DUI, violence, and sexual behavior. This model was useful, and we looked at this using traditional social science and social work methods, and wrote a number of papers and came up with some interventions and tested them, and they had some effect. But there was still this kind of challenge that they didn't really solve the problem at a level that was satisfactory from a number of perspectives. And so given that, I started working with a team of engineers, and this work started back 4 or 5 years ago when I was at Ohio State, and continued on to the present. And what I'm showing you here is basically one of the first mathematical models that the engineers and I came up with using some data that I'd collected in earlier studies back in San Diego. And we had data from 1,700 people who were intoxicated at bars or coming out of bars in San Diego. And we had information both on them and the group that they were with, their motivations for the night, et cetera. And we took a basic social psychology theory that I'm sure most of you've heard of, who've taken Psych 101, Lewin. And we took that data and we created a mathematical model and put my data into the mathematical model and ran some simulations. And basically what we were able to show was that even when people go out without the intent to become intoxicated, it only takes one influential individual to drag most of the other people off into heavier drinking. So this was an example of modeling the social environment and figuring out that it's pretty important to pay attention to the peer network when you're trying to intervene in real time. I'll give you another example. One of the things that we were interested in were how people move across locations over the course of a drinking event. And so if you were studying young people, folks in the military, college students, young adults, it's not uncommon to find them maybe starting out in one context that's a private context. And in this case, we would have a party, the graphic showing, and they would move then, or some people would move from that party to a bar setting, and then from a bar setting to another bar setting. And with each one of those moves, a new level of risk is introduced. Okay, so as you move from a party to a bar and a bar to another bar, those transition points are risky. And as the graphic illustrates, the squares, I believe, were males in this example, the circles were females. And all those arrows pointing from circles to squares and so on are social influence. Again, taken from data that we had. This is actually called an agent-based model that I'm showing you. But you can see the shading in those squares and circles changes over time. And those represent the person's level of intoxication. And so this model helps look at potential places to intervene within the course of a drinking event, both in terms of time and space. So do you intervene early? Do you intervene with an individual? Do you intervene with a group of people? Do you target males? Do you target females? Do you try to target the transition points? So these are the types of things that we're studying here when we're trying to understand how better to spend limited prevention dollars when we're trying to prevent problems like drunk driving, sexual assault, violence that's related to alcohol and the like. Okay, so let me just take a couple more minutes here and talk about future directions. I think increasingly we're going to see more technology in prevention and treatment. And this is a bit ironic, as I talked about the problem we're having now with technological addiction. But technology in and of itself is neutral, and we can harness the power of technology to help prevent problems and help people maintain healthy kind of lifestyles while they're in treatment and post-treatment. So one of the things that you're starting to see is something called geofencing. And basically your phone, or most smartphones now have a GPS built into them, along with some mapping software. You can take information from the individual and you can enter it into an app and basically kind of steer them away from high probability environments that they might find themselves getting into trouble. So in other words, if a person that had a specific drug problem used to frequent certain areas to buy their substance of choice, you could geofence that area, and some prompt would go to the person and their sponsor that they were getting into dangerous territory. The other application of this might be a high density alcohol area. So you could put in all the alcohol licenses and outlets in one area. And if someone had an alcohol problem, it would be good to know that they're heading into a bar district, for instance. The other thing is this just-in-time intervention that I talked about. And what this will probably look like is where people will be prompted during certain drinking events to drink more water, to eat more food, to order an Uber. It'd be the kind of thing you'd opt into and subscribe to, where you wanted to make sure you kept yourself safe in certain situations. And so there's a number of people working on that type of an intervention right now around the country. But this is going to be one of the big areas that'll kind of, I think, emerge in the next 20 years in addiction science. And then the final piece that I think we'll see coming is nano telehealth, which is basically where you'll be able to get snippets of advice from a professional in real time via text or FaceTime. And there's other people out there working on this right now as well. So you're going to see more technology in treatment and prevention. I think you're going to also see more collaboration with stakeholders. And this is kind of another piece that is very consistent with social work's approach to problems, in that people are starting to realize, scientists are starting to realize, and policymakers are starting to realize that for you to have a successful intervention, you need the input, the buy-in, and really full and true collaboration with the people that live in the communities that are affected. So collaborative modeling is one of these techniques that is starting to emerge, where you work with stakeholders to both understand the causes of the problem and potential solutions to the problem. And by the time you're done with this process, you have an intervention that was co-created by everyone involved, experts, people that are impacted by the problem, and so on. And there's a much more buy-in into the final outcome and the final approach to preventing or solving the problem. And then I think we'll see more specialization. And so whether you're a social worker or a social worker or a nurse or a public health person, I think that there's going to be more and more opportunities out there to earn a degree or joint degree that in addiction science. There will be certificates for certain areas of addiction science practice, and so on. And I just think that the opportunities to learn about this will be much richer in the coming years. And with that, I'm going to close up here, and we'll go on to the next segment of today's event.
Thank you, Dr. Don Clapp, for such a wonderful presentation. We will be taking a quick 5-minute break, and we will be back with our next keynote speaker. See you soon. Welcome back. Our second keynote speaker is Dr. Harold Pollack, who is the Helen Ross Professor at the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice at the University of Chicago. He is the co-founder of the University of Chicago Crime Lab, co-director of the University of Chicago Health Lab, and a committee member of the Center for Health Administration Studies at the University of Chicago. His current National Institute of Health-funded research concerns improve services for individuals at the boundaries of the behavioral health and criminal justice systems, disabilities, and 2 major new efforts to address the opioid epidemic in Illinois and across the nation. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Pollack.
Hi, I'm Harold Pollack. I'm the Helen Ross Professor at the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice, and co-director of the University of Chicago Urban Health Lab. Delighted to be with you today. Thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to be with you. I want to talk about some of the work that we're doing on how to prevent the next 911 call, really how to improve services for people who are at risk of a mental health or a behavioral crisis. And I should say this work is supported by NIMH, and we're very grateful for that. I should also say that I'm not by any stretch the smartest person in this room, and quite a number of people listed here are important collaborators in this work. Andrea Tentner with the data science, along with a whole series of doctoral student collaborators on qualitative and quantitative work, outreach workers, Jessica Smith-Atassi and Luberta Livingston, data scientist Zubin Jelba and Xander Bieberman, a number of people that are involved in just the mechanics of getting the data that we need and making sure that that we can have the proper relationships with the organizations that we work with so that we can do our work. And very grateful for all my collaborators in this work. So it's certainly not me alone presenting the work that I'm talking to you about today. So here are some themes for the next 3 hours, maybe the next 3 days. I want to start by describing the nature of the challenge a bit, talk about some Chicago street scenes, some first responder calls that we've had in Chicago, then talk about something that happened in a Maryland movie theater, and then something that happened on a United flight at O'Hare Airport. I'll talk about how we try to identify people at risk of behavioral crisis, for want of a better term, which is the term behavioral crisis really describes a diverse set of interactions where someone doesn't respond in ways that are expected or desired by first responders or by others. We'll try to give the mundane realities of emergency response their due. A lot of the public discourse around 911, police response, deals with big issues, big structural issues, big policy issues, very often the mundane realities that that police officers, that EMTs and others face in their daily jobs is actually way more important in some ways than the big issues that we talk about in policy discourse. I'll talk about person, place, and event-based strategies that we use to try to improve emergency response and follow-up. And I'll talk about some of the opportunities and challenges that we face when we try to use linked 911 data, police data, ambulance administrative data to identify people, places, and events where we might productively intervene. Then we'll compare two different strategies to try to find people who might be at risk and who we might help. One is what we call a high utilizer model, or sometimes it's called a frequent flyer model, something like that. People that demonstrate high use. There's the people who had 42 911 calls that involve police. And can we identify a core of people that way and see if we can intervene? And that's sort of the most natural thing that many of us think about. But there are other approaches too, and we use big data, predictive analytics, machine learning type approaches to try to identify and help vulnerable people who are at risk of a behavioral crisis, but maybe haven't had one, or haven't had one that involved police and so on. And then I'll close by noting the necessity, but also the limitations of improving first response as a way to help the most vulnerable people that I'm talking about in this presentation. Let me start with the challenge facing first responders. There's been a lot of prominent tragedies that involve first responders and individuals in behavioral crisis. Sometimes these crises are the result of serious mental illness, but they can also result from acute intoxication, from intellectual or developmental disabilities that have a behavioral component, or from other causes, maybe sometimes the medical complications of diabetes that lead people to behave in an unexpected way, to be non-compliant with instructions, to be verbally aggressive, or to be escalating in other ways, or to be behaviorally dysregulated. Now, I should say in my talk, I don't have any videos, but some of the discussion does involve describing some pretty upsetting violent incidents that involve vulnerable people. And so there's no harm or no foul if you want to go get a cup of coffee and check this out another time, or at least step away for the next 5-10 minutes. This is difficult stuff. My wife and I care for her brother. He lives with something called Fragile X syndrome. He's a 260-pound man, and we often think about what would happen if he had a behavioral crisis, and it's this is tough stuff. So I just wanted to share with you that if you want to step away for a little bit, that's okay. So here in Chicago, unfortunately, we've had some national headlines around some tragedies that resulted from these types of encounters. Probably the most famous one involved the shooting of Laquan McDonald. Laquan McDonald was a teenager who had a series of personal challenges, who was walking in the roadway. He had a knife, although the only thing that was harmed with his knife was he slashed a tire in a car, but he was being followed from a distance by police officers who were trying to figure out how to help him. There's actually a video of this long encounter that they had with him, which could have been in a police training film of how to do it right when someone's in a behavioral crisis, until Officer Jason Van Dyke drives up and fires 16 shots and murders Laquan McDonald. And that of course made national headlines. A second incident involved a young man named Quintonio Legrier. He was having a psychotic episode, and he was actually trying to get at his father, and he had a bat. And both Legrier and his father called 911 multiple times, and the 911 operator actually hung up on Quintonio Legrier, who was having a paranoid episode. Eventually, the police did come to the scene, and an officer shot and killed Quintonio Legrier, and actually also Betty Jones was also killed in the in that gunfire. And after the fact, this was a very, very contentious case, and you can imagine the reaction. The officer who killed Quintonio Legrier, Quintonio Legrier was charging at him with a baseball bat, and if we had a time machine, many of these incidents we could handle better than an actual human being in the moment facing a very frightening situation. And one of the things that I have learned in my work in this area is to appreciate the humanity on all sides in these very difficult encounters. I served on something called the Police Accountability Task Force in Chicago on the de-escalation working group, where we looked at ways we could improve police training, improve procedures in a variety of ways to try to make events like this, less likely to happen. And it was a very powerful experience for me to be in this work. Let me tell you another story that is also emblematic of the challenge. This young man named Robert Saylor, he actually lived with Down syndrome, and he was in his 20s, and he goes out to the movies with a young woman who was his sort of caretaker, and the movie's done, and he walks out into the lobby of the movie theater, and he gets very agitated. And the young woman calls his mom, and she says, he's really agitated. What should I do? And his mom says, why don't you go get the car, pull it around, maybe he'll calm down, and I'll come down to the theater, see if I can help. So the young woman goes, gets the car, and when she comes back, Mr. Saylor had gone back into the theater, and he had sat down in his original seat. He was agitated because he wanted to see the movie again. And he can't do that. He didn't pay for a ticket. And so the manager of the theater comes over and he starts getting into it with him. And he says, you can't do that. You got to buy a ticket. And things are getting heated. And the young woman shows up and she says, don't touch him. Don't, give him a little space. This is not going to work. And the manager basically dismisses this young woman. And she's a teenager, basically, like she's not going to tell him how to do his job. He calls mall security. Mall security is a couple of off-duty police officers who come, and they get into it with Saylor as well. And they basically communicate with him, you're gonna come with us, and we're gonna make you come with us. And they start struggling with him, and they pull him out of the chair, and he ends up on the ground with them on top of him. And his mother arrives to find that he has actually died, that he was asphyxiated. And it's very, very dangerous to restrain someone in a prone position. And particularly people with Down syndrome have some morphological vulnerabilities to that, but that is generally a very dangerous thing to do. And those officers had absolutely no intention to hurt this young man. They were actually charged. There was a homicide charge, and they said, look, we followed our training. Our training was to escalate to achieve compliance. And I have absolutely no doubt that they did not bear Robert Saylor ill will, but obviously that incident resulted in a tragedy. Another incident, fast forward, Dr. David Dow at O'Hare Airport. This was a story that was on national news. He was on a flight that was, I believe, overbooked, and the police came on and they said, you gotta, your ticket's not good. You have to get off the flight. And he refused. And the police ended up dragging him out, and they heard him when they dragged him out. And this got national news. And I think the major theme of national news was, wow, United service is really terrible. Why did they drag him off? His ticket was valid, or his ticket wasn't valid, etc. I don't care whether his ticket was valid. On the surface, what could be more different than Robert Saylor's situation and David Dow's situation? On the other hand, it's of course exactly the same scenario. There's a man in a chair who is being non-compliant, and that's actually very dangerous to drag someone out of a chair, and someone got really badly hurt. Imagine if the officers in that instance had said, Dr. Dow, we're not going to manhandle you. You may never be able to fly United again if you refuse to get off this flight. Is there someone else here that would just take $500 to just trade places with Dr. Dow because he's being a jerk and he's not getting off the plane? Imagine how different that scenario would have worked out. So one of the things that we focus on in some of our work is how to improve police training, and particularly de-escalation training. One of the striking things about this training is much less focus on recognizing specific conditions and more on applying time, distance, and cover principles to broad situations. You know, if you encounter Robert Saylor and you're a police officer, you're really not going to understand why he's responding the way that he did to you. But you can understand he's a man sitting in a chair who's being very defiant. And if they had just waited, his mom would have arrived and she would have bought him a ticket and everything would have been fine. Or she would have convinced him that he had to leave. You keep physical distance from the person so no one's fighting, no one's getting hurt. And you might need to take cover. In the case of Quintonio Legrier, the officer who shot Mr. Legrier would have been much better off if he had retreated and found an obstacle that would have protected him from this young man who had the bat. Time, distance, and cover, way more valuable than any specific diagnosis or specific tactical insight into a real-world situation. Part of the training that we also focus on is whether particular venues where there's a high risk of something like this happening, can you train the staff to do a better job? Group homes, the bus station, places like that. If you're going to call the police, what do you tell them? We spend a lot of time on things like this. In particular, we focus on 3 different kinds of interventions that seem to be helpful in different contexts. One is what we call person-based interventions. So if you can identify a person at risk, you can see if you have some services that you could offer that person that might be helpful. Some interventions are mental health interventions, like assertive community treatment. And there's a criminal justice version of that called forensic assertive community treatment, where you go out to the person and give them mental health treatment that they're probably not going to get if you ask them to come and show up at a clinic at Tuesday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Or maybe people need housing, or they need other kinds of care. Maybe they need physical health care. That's a person-based intervention. Harold's at risk. What can we do to help Harold? It's also event-based interventions. Are there particular scenarios? Someone calls 911, particular words are used where you say, you know what, I think this is a mental health crisis. Let's send out an officer who has good mental health training. Crisis intervention teams, crisis intervention training, CIT is the term that is usually used, where you want to send an officer out who's been specifically trained for people that are more likely to, to manage situations where people might have a mental health crisis or a related crisis. And there's also place-based interventions. We can go work with the staff at the bus station, at the homeless shelter, and other places where we think there's a predictable risk. We can also work with people in their own home. There's something called Smart 911, which is very helpful. Suppose that your first language is Vietnamese, and you have a son who is vulnerable to a behavioral crisis. You can actually register with Smart 911 so that when you call 911, something comes up on the computer screen of the operator that says, this person is speaking Vietnamese. Because of course the operator may not know the difference between Vietnamese and other East Asian languages when she's just hearing it. And with that information, she can get you quickly to someone who speaks the proper language to find out what your emergency is. Or maybe the Smart 911 says, my daughter has autism, and if you come to our home, please turn off the sirens, because that's just going to get her more agitated if she hears the siren. And of course, we look a lot at whether those people, places, and event interventions overlap. I mentioned at the beginning, we want to give the mundane realities of first response their due. Let me give you 2 examples. I think a lot of police officers understand very, very well we want to use the time, distance, and cover. We want to be humane to people that are having a behavioral crisis, but it's often very hard to do given the realities. One of the most basic realities is just how busy people are. I'll give you an example. Suppose that it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Tuesday, and I'm in Uptown in Chicago. That's a pretty low crime part of Chicago. And I'm standing in the middle of the road, and I'm telling Jesus to fuck off, and Jesus is arguing with me. And a bunch of people are looking at me, particularly, of course, as a middle-aged white dude with a lot of gray hair. It's pretty obvious what's happening. This is a guy who has serious mental illness. I mean, could be that I'm actually arguing with Jesus, but most of the time that's not what's happening. But most importantly, the police there, they can take 45 minutes to calm me down and to get people there to help me, to take me to a mental hospital, do what has to be done, because there's not a whole lot of other things happening that are emergencies at that same moment. One of the stories that we heard on the Police Accountability Task Force. There's a woman who was a CIT officer, and she was called to someone's home. He was sitting on his bed, and he was having a psychotic episode. He needed to go to a mental hospital. And she's talking to him, and she's really doing a great job calming him down, trying to get him to come with her in the police car to the mental hospital. But it's a Saturday night in one of the highest crime areas of Chicago. And while she's talking to this man, her cell phone is going nuts. And her supervisor is standing behind her. His cell phone is going nuts. We need you here. There's an emergency in this other place. There's a shooting over here. And at some point, her supervisor runs past her, tackles the man, and basically it was like, I had to wrap this thing up. I just didn't have 45 minutes on a Saturday night in this police district, to give you that time. And I'm sure that he would have wanted to, but he just couldn't. There were other emergencies. And when you think about issues like defund the police, one of the real challenges that we have in making that real is making sure that some of the very humane policing practices that we definitely want first responders to follow, they're pretty labor intensive. They take a lot of time and manpower. We want to make sure that the people have that time and manpower to do this properly. So giving the mundane realities of first response their due is just really important. So now let me tell you about how we try to use administrative data in Chicago to identify vulnerable people that we can help. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we're trying to predict who's at risk of a behavioral crisis, one that involves first responders. And we use two different methods and compare their strengths and weaknesses. One is the traditional sort of frequent flyer high user model. Who has had a lot of these encounters in the past that we could identify and then reach out to and try to help. And the second is using sort of big data, machine learning, predictive analytics. Can we identify people maybe before any 911 call that looks exactly like this is made? And we use what's called random forest methods that some of you may be familiar with. What are the strengths and weaknesses of these different approaches? So we actually published in the American Journal of Public Health a descriptive analysis of high users that we found in 2016 and 2017. And you can see the full team that Andrew Tentner was the first author on this, and many other people that I mentioned at the beginning are co-authors. We went and we examined quite a large number of people and just looked at who are the top people. What was interesting was when we looked at our top 10 utilizers, our top person had 42 emergency events, 37 behavioral health events that involved at least the fire department. And he was arrested 5 times, 2 felony arrests, and 3 misdemeanor arrests. But most of the people that we looked at, a bunch of them were arrested a lot. There was one, number 3 was arrested 14 times. Almost nobody here was arrested for a really serious felony in our data set. For one obvious reason. If you went out and committed an armed robbery, you're not going to be a high user because you're locked up. You can't be having another 911 call because you're in the Illinois Department of Corrections. So the kinds of crimes that that were bringing them in contact with police were sometimes serious or scary, but not super serious violent felonies, because otherwise they would be incarcerated. We also looked at the top 10 places. Homeless shelter, mental health facility, both of Chicago's major airports, and a lot of train stations. It was actually kind of funny that our first analysis, we went and we presented it to the first responders in the fire department. And there were 2 things that were just hilarious. One was we had this whole elaborate zip code analysis. We'd start saying, this zip code, there's just a lot happening in the zip code. And as we started to talk, at some point I took a breath and somebody raised his hand. He said, dude, there's nothing interesting about that zip code. None of the people that we get calls on in that zip code actually live there. That's just the end of the red line. Those are all people asleep at Howard Station or at 95th Street. And the other thing that was funny was we disguised all the individuals that we were talking about. And we start to talk about somebody, and then all of a sudden somebody would say, isn't that guy in the red jacket who's always on the blue line, sort of talking about the White Sox or whatever? Chicago's a city of 2.7 million people. It's a pretty small town when you start talking about the really extreme high users of 911. And it was really striking. People recognized a lot of our folk. And we really had to be very careful from a human subject's point of view not to reveal any information that was identifiable by people for whom this is their, this is their job, is to respond to these calls. And we found these high user models had some real strengths when we focused on those high users. One is we really could identify a core group of people that had really high rates of 911 calls and had a really high risk of having another one in the next 6 months. By the way, the most common reason for police to be involved was a survival crime, shoplifting alcohol or a pair of socks from the supermarket. And low-level offenses that would get them into it with security. I would say sometimes, by the way, these offenses, you might say, why are we even arresting these people? And that's my general reaction. Sometimes scary things did happen. There was a young woman who was continually shoplifting like crazy and getting arrested a lot or having encounters a lot. Usually it didn't actually end in an arrest, but had some sort of an encounter where she was kicked out of the store or something like that. Well, one time she was shoplifting and an 85-year-old shopkeeper came out and tried to prevent her from stealing his stuff, and she punched him in the face and he got hurt. These are potentially dangerous situations. And these high user models can identify people like that. They're simple and transparent, and that's a big plus. But they also have some really important limitations. One is, by definition, these high user models are not about prevention. People are already well in the midst of some really serious problems. So if you want to do prevention, these models are already past that point. Also, there are people who have episodic crises that would self-resolve. So some of the people, they had a ton of calls and then none later, and they would show up in these high user models, but they're not at future risk. And also the high users have distinctive needs that don't always match the interventions that we have available. Very, very often the intervention that we have available is sending mental health providers out to help people with assertive community treatment, something like that. Well, if somebody has a really chronic alcohol use disorder, it's not exactly clear that that's really what they need or that's going to be helpful to them, or even that any sort of Medicaid or other payer will pay for you to go out and do that service for that person. So when we turn to the machine learning and the predictive analytics, we sometimes found that that was working better. And also the machine learning told us things about people that were very helpful for clinical and policy interventions. Sometimes words came out that were in the EMT notes that really lit things up in our machine learning that we wouldn't have spotted if we were just looking at frequent flyers. This person was aggressive. That was very predictive of something's going to happen in the future with that person that you wouldn't get if you just counted how many calls they had. We also found that when we were trying to look at a larger population, not just the top 100 people, but maybe the top 5,000 people, that the machine learning seemed to do a lot better. But here's just the obligatory snazzy machine learning predictive analytics slide. When you look at one of these pipeline models, all of our students think they're going to show up and spend all their time way to the right on this diagram. So, should I be using random forest? Should I be using lasso? Should I be doing this model or that model? Let's go to the blackboard and start writing down a bunch of calculus. What you actually spend almost all your time on is way to the left in the sort of preparing the data and cleaning the data. So you have like Rob Johnson and John Robson were both arrested on the red line in the week of April 22nd. Is that the same guy? How many different ways can you misspell homeless? A lot of practicalities of data that's being entered by first responders who are sort of very busy in the moment, or someone calling 911 who's scared and giving a 30-second description, and the data, it's messy. You have to learn how to analyze the data and understand what the data is. And so a lot of folks on our team just spend a ton of time just trying to understand what is the data generating process and how do I understand how to make sense of what's here. And we had some really interesting interplay between our qualitative research and our big data research, just try to understand what do certain words mean? Why do people write them in the notes? We did a random forest classifier with about 400 variables in there. And we basically used data from May 1st, 2016 to April 31st, 2017 to try to predict who was going to have the events that we were looking for between May and October of 2017. So use this first period as our testing period, our training period, and our second period as what we call our test period. We had data on about 143,000 unique people who had at least one fire department ambulance event or an arrest event, during that May 1st, 2016 to April 31st, 2017 period. And our classifier tried to understand who was at risk for a behavioral health involved police encounter, in that test period. Our random forest classifier, we really focused on what's called precision and identifying people at risk for a behavioral crisis that involved police. By precision, we mean if we said you were at high risk, how often did this behavioral crisis actually happen for someone like you, during that May to October 2017 period? And we needed that. You want high precision because if I'm going to spend a lot of money going out giving services to Harold, I want to know Harold's actually at a really high risk of something bad happening. And so that precision measure is very important for understanding like the cost effectiveness of some of the interventions that we want to study. And we did another thing that was interesting and useful, which is we performed what are called leave-out experiments. There are lots and lots of variables in the data that we analyzed. And some of those data raised ethical, legal, administrative questions that really had to be addressed. So, we had people's race in there. We had whether or not someone was arrested before. And we had other variables that you might say, it's a little bit problematic to use that variable. Suppose that I have a son and he's having a problem and I call 911 and I say, my son is really having some sort of a mental health problem and I need an ambulance to come and help him. Do I really want some algorithm to take into account, well, he's Black, or well, he's arrested 2 years ago? There's some really serious questions there, legal, ethical. So what we did is we performed experiments where we blinded our computer algorithms to some of the problematic variables, and we looked at how these algorithms would perform if we put to the side variables that were not appropriate to use. Because one thing about machine learning is it will use any information it has, and some of that information is inappropriate to use. And so we wanted to look at questions like that. And of course, in 2021 America, you can imagine 50 reasons why that's incredibly important. So what did we find when we compared the models? One thing we found was that when we were looking at a really small group of people, the frequent flyer high user models did basically almost as well as machine learning predictive analytics. If you want to find 150 people in Chicago who are really at high risk, we kind of know who those people are. And these high user approaches are simple to implement, are very transparent, and work pretty well with that really strong segment. But there's some problems with this. One is, some people self-resolve and you're identifying someone who's not going to have a problem in the future. Second is, of course, we've given up on prevention. Some things, they're way down the trajectory in many cases of things that we would have loved to have prevented at some earlier point. And a lot of the high users we identified just did not correspond very well to interventions that we had available to help people. And so we went to our machine learning models and tried to look at those. And what we found was the machine learning models worked a lot better when we were trying to look at a much larger population. We're not looking at the top 100 people in Chicago. We're trying to look at the top 5,000 people in Chicago. And the machine learning was much better for that larger group. It was also much better at trying to understand people who are not likely to self-resolve and who have issues that actually matched up with the interventions that we had to offer. And very often the machine learning models identified particular aspects of people's trajectories that were also very helpful to talk to clinicians and policymakers about, to say, hey, here's some things that happened in a 911 episode that kind of tell us, wow, I'm really concerned about this person having another one like it, that you couldn't have gotten if you just counted how many 911 calls were made. We did identify some people before they had any 911 calls, say, that involved police, because the predictive analytics was able to identify, hey, this person's at risk. And we identified some really important issues like housing instability and some psychiatric issues that were just really helpful in understanding, wow, this is a person that we want to really focus on, that we would never have gotten through just the high user strategy. Just if you want to see some numbers, we compared the precision of the machine learning models with the high user models. And by precision, we mean if the model flagged you as being at risk, how likely was it that that risk actually was realized for you, in that following 6-month period? And we found that if we tried to identify the top 0.1% of people in Chicago in our data, that the two models performed very, very similarly. But as we enlarged the group, and we went, say, to the top 5%, that the machine learning identification strategies just really outperformed consistently the high user strategy. And so if you're trying to look at a large population of people that you might be able to provide some help for, the machine learning really did do a lot better than just counting how many 911 calls people had. So let me just close with some final policy observations. As I mentioned, we want to appreciate the necessity, but also the limitations of improved police first response in helping people at risk of behavioral crises. I do feel from this work and other work that I don't have time to talk to you about now, we put so much burden on police and other first responders to address failures that are happening in other systems. The mental health system fails, the housing system fails, the addiction treatment system fails, mental health system fails, and then the police become involved. And if the police fail and someone's taking a cell phone video, we say, why didn't the police do a better job? And that's not fair to police. Second thing is, I think the biggest failures for many of the people that we studied might be called the second response, which is no less important and is equally fraught from first response. So the most common tragic failures are less visible than a front page story, say like the Laquan McDonald video. There's not going to be a video of those things. And it's really what happens 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months after a 911 call is made. Who's following up when vulnerable people require help? Very often the answer is no one is following up. Nothing is happening. There is no second response until the next 911 call is made. Predictive analytics may help us do better than that. We need to do that. But we also need to bring new people, new organizations to our posse. We need social workers, we need co-responders, we need the medical system to help. We can't leave this to police officers, to ambulances, to EMTs, to the other first responders. It's not fair to those first responders. It's not fair to the people who need help. It's not fair to their loved ones who need to have the confidence that they need to know they can call 911 and get the help that they need safely with their loved one, and that they will get the kinds of follow-up and services that they're going to need so that they won't need a 911 call in the future. That's the real challenge. It's not just managing that 911 call better. It's really taking the whole trajectory and finding better ways to help people when they're not in crisis or after a crisis has occurred. So thank you so much for letting me share my work with you. And thank you so much for the folks that filmed this, that did such a professional job and put up with the logistics of my home. And it was great to be with you today. And again, thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'd like to welcome back Dr. John Clapp, Dr. Harold Pollack, and welcome Dean Sarah Gellert from the USC Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work, who will be moderating the conversation.
Thank you. I want to thank my current colleague, John Clapp, and my former colleague, Harold Pollack, for their presentations. And I'm really interested in seeing the audience questions. We have several now, but I want to urge the audience to continue to send us questions. So the first question is for John. At work in a string exchange, I found an agent-based model useful to move people to look at medication for opioid use. I'm wondering how this could be used at other points where injection drug users interact with systems.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, what we found most useful with the agent-based models when we were doing our modeling was to kind of flesh out the smaller systems processes. So once we had the big dynamical models kind of nailed down, we were using the smaller models to kind of look at emergent behavior. So I think if you can start narrowing down the kind of the scope of what you're trying to model, those models become increasingly useful in applied settings.
Okay. So we then have a question for Harold Pollack. How can a social work student get trained in de-escalation techniques and conflict resolution?
That's a great question. I think that it is. I think each school probably handles it a little bit differently. There are a number of videos online, and you can also just look at the CIT training that police officers get, and it actually gives you pretty good basic training. I think that each setting has its own unique challenges. So I think if I were getting de-escalation training and I was working in a particular setting, say with people with serious mental illness, there would be a little bit different training from the training that you would get if you were, say, in a homeless shelter working with folk who might have an alcohol disorder. And I'd be happy after this seminar's over to send some resources if you send me your contact information. We recently did some qualitative interviews with mental health professionals in Chicago, and they identified a number of resources that they use with their staff. So I'm happy to provide that information.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Harold. I was wondering where that de-escalation training should happen. In the classroom? Should we expect students to pick it up themselves? And what can the school do you think, to help in planning and furthering it?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think one is I think there needs to be a discussion in a classroom of the importance of it and some very simple principles. The time and distance principles that police officers use is important. Just the idea that to be self-aware. When I think about some of the core social work principles, I remember my first day on a social work faculty. One of my colleagues spoke about relationship, engagement, self-awareness as three key principles of that every social worker needs to bring to interactions. A lot about de-escalation is those three things. To understand when someone is behaviorally dysregulated, you're not going to exactly know why they're dysregulated in that moment. And the truth is that that's not necessarily useful, even if you did know, to understand how to de-escalate the situation, to be self-aware about. Very often we escalate situations because we're trying to assert our authority, and because it's extremely annoying and unsettling when someone is exhibiting certain behaviors that you very much wish they were not doing in that moment. And sometimes it's very hard to step back and to de-escalate and to just be self-aware. Hey, I actually, principle number one, make sure I'm not escalating, and then I can get to the de-escalating. Because my wife and I take care of her brother. He's a 260-pound gentleman, and some of the things that he does, sometimes I find myself, wanting to assert my authority in a way that would not be helpful to him or to me, and just to be able to step back in those moments and say it's not about whether this person is responding to me in the ideal way in this moment. It's really is he safe? Am I safe? Is everyone safe? And to distinguish annoying behaviors and counterproductive behaviors in various ways from behaviors that are actively, that are dangerous, that you have to respond to. And that most behaviors are in that first category. So I will leave it there, but I'll send some resources after the talk that folks might find helpful.
Thank you. I'm just sort of wondering, there's a lot of talk now about pairing social workers with police. And wondering what the two of you think about that, the potential of it, and what it might mean for substance abuse and addiction.
John, you want to start?
Sure. And I'll even add a little to it. I think we can consider pairing social workers with fire personnel too. So I worked on a project in Columbus where we were doing that. But I think in general, it's a great idea, and there's a lot of potential there. you basically, you know, at USC, we've actually had a number of students in social work, MSW students in police department internships, and it's usually very well received by the police. That's been our experience. There's always a bit of a culture clash between, you know, two kind of distinct professions. But I think it's the viability of that becomes clear fairly quickly. On the fire example in Columbus, we actually had the fire department come to the School of Social Work, realizing that they needed assistance and that a lot of their repeat 911 callers were either elderly folks who were lonely or people with substance use problems that weren't getting the help they needed. And so it was using up their resources to respond to accidents, other health issues, and so on. So.
But I've heard very similar things in Chicago. Just a couple things I would add to that. One is that with the fire folks, it is also important to address addiction stigma. One of the things that we found in our work is that, you know, if I'm standing out in the street and I'm cursing at Jesus and Jesus is cursing back at me, the first responders are going to be really pretty compassionate towards that person, particularly if it's Tuesday at 2:00 in the afternoon when they have the time to be compassionate, because that person is exhibiting very stereotypical signs of psychosis that the first responders are going to recognize. When there's alcohol in the mix, you very often get a different response, and a more angry and moralized response, even if in fact what's happening is a dual diagnosis issue. And one of the things that we could train the first responders in is and stuff like that. The second thing about the co-responder model I think is really important is to look beyond managing the specific incident. A lot of what people want from the co-responder model and what people talk about is safely navigating the actual confrontation. And there's no question that's important. You know, we don't want somebody to get beat up. We don't want someone to get shot because they're dysregulated. And if social workers can help in that, that's great. But the real gap is what happens 2 days later. Who's coming back to the home? If it's, say, in a private home or a group home, who's coming back and saying, well, let's talk about what might have happened that precipitated the issue so that we can come up with better strategies so that we can de-escalate for the next time. But also, you know, what has to be done to make sure everybody's safe, to make sure that if they say a gentleman was having a crisis, was there follow-up services? Sometimes if it's not a private home, if it's say a group home for people with psychiatric or developmental disabilities, a social worker can also ask some somewhat embarrassing questions. You know, how is the staff trained to deal with this issue? Very often the staff, when someone is acting up, will say, you know, if you don't calm down, I'm going to call the cops. You know, that is not a de-escalation strategy. And very often a social worker can come back and say, let's just make sure everybody in the setting is okay and has their needs met. You know, what else is going on here that I can help with? So I think the co-responder model is really good if you try to take a longitudinal perspective on the needs of everyone in that setting.
So we're getting some good questions here. There's another one for you, Harold, that's a particularly tough one. Not to set you up, but should we look at rephrasing defund the police? And should police departments hire social workers, or should that be handled by a separate agency that 911 reaches out to? But mostly defund the police.
Well, those are both good questions. I do think it's probably valuable for the social workers to be independent of the police. I think that they have, I think that given some of the challenges in police community relationships, that the social workers may have an advantage if they are not connected, if they're not employees of the police agencies, and we can also have them in a whole supervisory structure that is social work. Defund the police. I will tell you that I will put on my hat as as a political person, because I'm a political advocate in various things, defund the police from a tactical point of view for progressive politicians is one of the most toxic slogans you could have in this domain. You know, if you have a slogan that you have to explain to people, it doesn't mean what it literally seems to mean. That's often a sign that your messaging needs to be worked on. And I think there's a couple problems. One is a lot of people in communities that have challenges with police still need the police. And making a humane police reaction is often very labor intensive. One of the things that we find in Chicago, I mentioned Thursday, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, police can be pretty humane to a person in a mental health crisis. If it's a Saturday night in a high crime part of Chicago, they just don't have 45 minutes to spend with somebody to help that person calm down. They just don't have enough officers per crime to do that. And so, they will not be as gentle. And also a lot of the resources that we need for mental health services and social services, there's no particular reason that has to come from the police budget. You know, the Medicaid budget completely dwarfs the police budget. And Medicaid should be financing a lot of the things that people need. And there's no particular reason that we need to defund the police if our goal is to fund mental health and social services and housing. We need much bigger dollars from a different funding source to do that. So those are my reactions.
Thank you, Harold. Another question for John here. What would be some effective proactive strategies to use to help prevent addiction?
So that's a great question too. And historically, we've looked at that in a number of different ways. From a social work perspective, it's often looked at as early in the developmental cycle, right? So kind of positive youth development and those sorts of things. If you take that strategy and then you start to add on other levels of abstraction, looking at the social environment and the built environment, the policy environment, that's where the most effective strategies for prevention come into play, because it tends to be a complex problem with a lot of dynamic variables. And so to the extent that you can get individuals to have some resiliency strategies to mitigate risk, and then you build an environment that is conducive to promoting those strategies and allowing people to kind of exercise good judgment and not have undue pressure to use, whether it's alcohol or other drugs. Those are the approaches that tend to work the best. So tend to be sustainable, comprehensive approaches that target multiple levels.
And when would you start in the life cycle?
That's another great question. I've worked on projects as early as preschool, and at that age, it's more about health. So it's kind of teaching children about healthy behaviors. Most people, there's not uniform agreement on when to introduce the substance related issues, but most people feel that should happen in late grade school before middle school.
Okay, thank you. So back to Harold, we're going to change the venue a little bit here. Are there resources you'd recommend for social workers that work in the prison system that would be helpful for correctional officers?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the time, distance, and cover principles would still be very applicable in a correctional setting. I'll have to do some research on that. I want to be careful not to speak beyond my expertise. I do think that one thing that the correctional setting certainly brings out is that it has to go beyond managing the specific incident and to say, what is it about the day-to-day life of people in the secure environment that either promotes or doesn't promote violence. A well-managed prison system does not have to have a high level of interpersonal violence. And I think many of us assume that the correctional setting is more violent than it needs to be. And if you look, and so there are best practices in prison management that I think anyone in that setting needs to be familiar with. There's I think one of the things that we fight in the correctional world is a sense of a lack of efficacy that we can make it a more humane environment, given all the challenges and given some of the offenses that put people in the prison system. And so if we look at, say, well-run federal facilities, they are safe. And so I think we should approach that with a sense of confidence that there's a lot we can do to prevent those things from happening, and to make sure people get mental health care that they need, and that they're treated in a way that is de-escalating.
And we hope well-managed prison system doesn't involve an oxymoron.
Yeah.
So did you want to comment on that, John? If not, I've got another question for you.
No, let's go on to the next question.
Okay. What do you suggest as some ways that psychiatric social workers in an urgent care clinic where 75% of patients suffer with psychosis and delusions from substance use can help stabilize a person in this setting? Y'all are getting tough questions.
Yes, that is a tough question. So it's difficult in that setting if someone's actively experiencing substance-induced psychosis. I've in general, I think that kind of emergency acute environment is a very difficult environment for substance abuse prevention and intervention, and especially if it's a general emergency department or emergency room. It's very hard to kind of get that for some of the same reasons that Harold mentioned on the police side with resources. So it's a little bit of a time of day, how busy is it, and that sort of thing. That said, the best thing is having adequate training around how to de-escalate those situations, to try to determine if there's an OD probability with the person, so it's a series of kind of triage steps to ensure that things don't escalate further than that. But in general, I'd say it's a combination of training and having the adequate amount of resources available.
And maybe Medicaid could put some money into that too.
Yeah, that would be nice.
So a question for Harold, which allows you to opine. What does your ideal first responder system look like, and what role would social workers play?
Well, I think that having a co-responder model is helpful, and having clinicians at the 911 setting would be very helpful. When the call comes in, I think the call takers and dispatchers could use some social work support in understanding what type of response is needed. I think that I think the ideal first response needs to include a second response. Would be one thing I would opine, that we need to take a longitudinal view and make sure that we have social work involved in the full along every phase of what's sometimes called the intercept model, when people have mental health challenges that might bring them into contact with either first responders or the criminal justice system. And if you have a perfect first response system with no follow-up, that is an oxymoron. And I think I think the advent of the cell phone and all of the attention to specific responses sometimes distracts us from that. I also think, by the way, we need to understand there's fragile humans involved in every aspect of that, both the people making the calls, the people fielding the calls, and the people responding to the calls. And I was thinking about that a lot when I was watching an example that was, I was watching the George Floyd trial, and where there was a homicide. And I was thinking many of the cases that I have reviewed of police making mistakes in a 911 call look so different from what we saw in the George Floyd case. And I think that even an ideal first responder system, we have to be humane about the difficulty that everyone in that system is going to have sometimes, and there's going to be mistakes. There's going to be errors of omission and commission. And we need to be able to approach that with the right mixture of accountability and empathy and a systemic rather than an individual perspective when a response goes wrong. Because I think the officers feel very vulnerable that if they go out to a home because there's been a call and something goes wrong, that they will be held responsible. And we have made them the front line of our mental health and addiction system and put them into many situations that's beyond their training. And I think we have to, as a social work community, we have to be part of the posse to help fix that. And we also have to be empathetic to understand that it's just a tough gig. And one of the things that I do is I've seen a lot of police body cam videos, and if you put me in those situations, sometimes I would err, and so do they. So I would that was my opining.
And unless you have something to add, John, I've got another question for you.
Sure.
Okay. How does decriminalization and legalization of certain drugs impact prevention and treatment of addiction?
So another great question, and I think we're in the second large grand experiment with substance use. The first one being prohibition, this one being the legalization or decriminalization of marijuana. And as you move from illicit to licit markets, the big thing to look at is availability. So we know from the alcohol world and the cigarette world that the cost of the substance drives use, and that especially use among vulnerable populations, young people. And so to the extent you can control the price of the substance through responsible policy, control the marketing through various means, so things aren't target marketed at communities of color or children. Those are all the things that we've learned from the alcohol and tobacco world that really I think are going to have to be applied to the marijuana world. For other substances, you could look to international models, and it varies greatly, but in the Netherlands, there's been quasi-decriminalized heroin for a number of years, and they've done very well at regulating it. And so, it really becomes a harm reduction health model for I'd say the substances that are least likely to be decriminalized or legalized here, versus things like marijuana that are going to be really become increasingly widespread in the next several years.
I think we have one last question, and it seems to be for John. What are your thoughts on parenting education and family education in addiction science? How can parents teach their children about addiction?
So that's another great question, and it's an area that's historically been somewhat controversial. You've had kind of two camps: the teach abstinence camp, which I don't think works very well, and the kind of be realistic and understand your child type of approach. And so every child is different, right? And so the education that you give them, the information you give them, and when you give them the information, how it's delivered, has to be carefully thought through. There's, unfortunately, I think we're in an environment now, especially with alcohol, that the access at the school level, and marijuana as well, at the middle school level, the grade school, upper years of grade school is so prevalent that if you're really trying to wait till your child you think they're using based on when you first used or something like that, you're probably well behind the curve. So I really suggest it takes an assessment of your own situation, and and the environment you live in. You know, different areas have different. I moved from San Diego to Ohio for a while. Very different environments for use for young adults and children. So you know your context and then kind of move appropriately. But I do think you have to err on educating sooner than later.
Thank you both. I think we've run out of time for this segment, but I'm really looking forward to continued cross-school and cross-university conversations about these incredibly important issues. So thank you both.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much for this thought-provoking conversation, and we will be back in 5 minutes with additional speakers. See you soon. Hello, welcome back, and thank you for joining us. Dr. Jordan Davis and Dr. Eric Peterson are research partners on a number of innovative multidisciplinary initiatives to improve the lives of veterans. Dr. Peterson is an associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Keck School of Medicine at USC. And his research is primarily in the areas of young adult and adolescent alcohol use and comorbid mental health disorders. Dr. Davis is an assistant professor at the USC Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work and has devoted much of his career to research addressing substance abuse and developmental needs of marginalized and vulnerable populations. Welcome, Dr. Peterson and Dr. Davis.
To start talking about examining behavioral health among American veterans during COVID-19, during this current pandemic. I'll talk about some of the introductory material and then get into some of the methods of the study. And then I'll toss it over to Jordan, who will talk a little bit about some of the results that we are finding from this study. So next slide, please. So veterans are at risk for multiple behavioral health problems. And when I say behavioral health problems, the ones we're really focused on in this study are post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, depression, anxiety, and substance use disorders. And so here you see there's really a range among studies of what you'll see for veterans. And so it's pretty difficult to just nail down a specific number. These numbers come from a range of research studies, clinical samples, as well as stats you find from a VA. And so you see that about 11 to 20% of veterans have PTSD or meet criteria for PTSD, about 13 to 15% meet criteria for depression, and about 11 to 24% across these studies meet criteria for a substance use disorder. And again, the main substance use disorders you see are alcohol use disorder and cannabis use disorder. There's also a high overlap between these disorders. Estimates of co-occurring PTSD and depression, for example, can be about 50%. And then there's also co-occurrence between substance use disorders and these mental health disorders as well, almost to the point where if you have one, it's very likely that you will have one of the others. Okay, next slide, please. So because veterans are already vulnerable to these behavioral health problems, we wanted to look and see, how are they doing during this current COVID-19 pandemic? And so those who have these prior conditions, some studies have been done outside of the veteran population or with non-veteran samples to show that these individuals who have pre-existing conditions are not doing so great during COVID. And so the biggest thing is really that there is now this additional traumatic event or this stressor that has now happened to them, which may lead to increases in symptoms, increases in depression, increases in PTSD symptoms, as well as possible reactions to manage those symptoms, such as drinking heavily or using cannabis. What you see so far is you don't see a lot of veteran research. There's a little that's emerging right now. But most of the research that's out there on how people are doing during the pandemic is focused on general samples, and it's also cross-sectional. So meaning that there's usually just one time point that people look at. So maybe, in November of the pandemic or August. Some studies do look at 2 time points, but often those are just 2 time points after the pandemic has broke. Next slide, please. So what Jordan and I did was we had this study that was running with a large sample of veterans that we recruited from the community where we conducted a proposed one-time survey of veterans in February of 2020. So really right before the pandemic hit and the lockdown orders went into effect. And so the purpose of that survey was to get a big sample of veterans, ask them a bunch of questions about mental health and substance use, and then plug some of those data that we were getting into an intervention that we were developing to try to help veterans reduce their substance use and actually seek more formal treatment for substance use and mental health disorders. So COVID hit right after February, and we thought this would be great if we could follow up with this sample and see how they're doing a couple of months after the pandemic. And so we got some additional funding and then delivered a survey to veterans through their email and asked them if they would like to participate in an additional survey. About a 30-minute survey. We gave them a $20 Amazon gift card to do this thing. And so then we asked them if they wanted to continue. And so we have a survey 6 months after the pandemic hit in August 2020, then another one 9 months after in November, and then one in February of 2021, which we just completed, which marks about 1 year after that first survey that we gave. Next, please. And then we also want to continue following this sample. So these are 3 future time points. We have funding to go through February of 2022. So we're able to actually see how people are doing in terms of their substance use and mental health through February of 2020. Next, please. So the study has many goals, but the 2 that we're really going to focus on today are we're using these data, these 7 time points, to look at changes in substance use, primarily alcohol and cannabis use, and changes in mental health symptoms, PTSD symptoms, depression, and anxiety symptoms in reaction to COVID-19 across these waves. This is a mixed method study, which means that we gave participants surveys that they completed on their mobile phones or over the internet on their computers. And then we also did some qualitative methods where we conducted interviews with 23 veterans. This we did 6 months after the pandemic broke and then 1 year after. Next, please. So I call these post 9/11 veterans. Most of them are Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom veterans, but post 9/11 meaning they served after 9/11, 2001. We focused on what we're calling young adults, 18 to 40. We're kind of stretching it on the young adult there, but they were recruited from social media and these veteran-specific news sites in February, again, of 2020. And we focused on this group because for the intervention that we want to develop, we want to enroll veterans that are kind of in the early stages of discharge. So most of them will discharge, when they're 21, in their late 20s or early 30s. And so we want to get them where before their symptoms of PTSD, depression, anxiety really become chronic and encourage them to come in for care. So that's why the age range is like that. We recruited 1,230 veterans. They completed a baseline survey, and then we invited them to a follow-up survey, and we contacted them by email and asked them if they wanted to be involved. Next slide, please. So this is just the flow again. In February of 2020, this is time 1, 1,230 veterans. They completed a survey. Then again, 6 months later, in August of 2020, here we had 84% of those that completed that initial survey complete this 6-month survey. Then at the 9 months, we had 82%. And then at the 1 year, we had another 82%. So pretty good retention rate over time. Next, please. Here you can just see a brief snapshot of the sample. They're about 34, 35 on average, mostly men, 90% men, 9% women, and mostly white, 83% white. And then here we actually, in terms of branch, it was mostly Army veterans, so mostly male Army veterans. Just keep that in mind when we're describing the findings. About 12% Air Force, 9% Marine Corps, and 8% Navy. Next, please. And so then of these veterans, about 1/3 of the sample screened positive for PTSD, depression, or anxiety. So when we advertised the study, we didn't say this was a study of mental health and substance use. We advertised it as, if you're a veteran and you're interested in the survey study, please click on this link and come take this pretty easy survey and get an Amazon gift card. And so this actually matches with what we see in the population too, which is nice. But we did find that it was a pretty heavy drinking sample. So about half screened positive for a substance use disorder. And this was actually alcohol was the primary one here. Okay, next. So that was the survey part of the study. The second part of the study was the interviews that we did. And so we interviewed 23 veterans. We interviewed them over Zoom, and we started this in September of 2020, and we used these semi-structured interviews. Again, we see that this sample pretty much closely matched what we had in the survey sample in terms of 90% men, mostly white, and mostly Army. But here we're able to draw on a few more from the Marine Corps at least. Again, about a third screened positive for one of these behavioral health conditions, alcohol use disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, PTSD, and depression. They came from about 16 different states. And now we have some plans to follow up with these veterans in the summer of 2021, probably around August, September of this year. So that's a description of the sample. I'm going to toss it over to Jordan now, who's going to take you through some of the findings that we have through at least the first year of the study.
Great, thanks, Eric. Next slide, please. So one thing that we were really lucky enough to do is we were able to ask all of our veterans about their reactions to COVID, meaning how are you doing during this time of COVID? And we had this scale that that really describes negative reactions to COVID. And these columns, there's a lot of numbers here. It's not worth really describing all of them, but that first column is actually the average item level response during the first 3 months of COVID. That middle column is during the second 3 months of COVID. So you can see each item has a different meaning. So one is felt nervous, I slept less, et cetera, et cetera. And as you can see, as you move from the first to that second column, everything is increasing. But the one thing that we really want to look at is that very bottom line that is bolded in that last line. And what this is showing is on average, so when we take these negative reactions to COVID, and we sum everything up, on average, veterans were reporting about a 55% increase in their negative reactions to COVID from the first 3 months to the second 3 months. And as we started thinking about this, now, mind you, this is just straight descriptive, just really thinking about how are people doing in terms of just some basic behavioral health. We wanted to know, as Eric said, how do some of these reactions maybe differ across various behavioral health disorders? So next slide, please. And as you can see, we decided to look at, again, the total negative reactions to COVID by time one PTSD status. So Eric mentioned that about 33% screened positive for PTSD at time one. And that gray bar is that increase in the negative reactions to COVID. And the red bars are for those without PTSD is the red, and the gray is for those with PTSD. And as you can see, while it might not be apparent with sort of the eyeball test, this is a significant increase for those with PTSD, meaning they're reporting worse reactions to COVID during the first 6 months compared to those without PTSD at time one. And we did do this for depression, we did this for anxiety, we did this for alcohol use disorder. We're not going to show every single result because they actually all mirrored pretty close to what you're seeing here in terms of how people with pre-COVID behavioral health disorders actually increased their negative reactions to COVID during these first 6 months. Next slide, please. Okay, so the other really great thing about this study is we have longitudinal data. And as Eric said, a lot of this past research that's looking at changes in alcohol use, for example, across the general population. You may be hearing in the news that, US adults on average are reporting greater alcohol use, greater drug use, et cetera. Unfortunately, when you actually break that down in terms of scientific meaning, how much meaning does those results actually have? They're actually only showing about people are reporting a half a drink more per week during COVID. So while it might be statistically significant, we're not really sure how clinically meaningful that is. So the one thing we're able to do with this data is, as you can see, we have a pre-COVID, a 6-month, a 9-month, and a 12-month time point. And we're able to actually model changes in behavior over time. And what this is doing here, this is something called a growth model. And we're simply showing the change trajectory in alcohol use during the first year of COVID. And as we can see, the veterans are actually reporting a decrease in past 30-day alcohol use. In fact, they started off around 12, 13 days of alcohol use in the past 30 on average. And during that first 6 months, they decreased to almost 8. And as you can see, they're sort of starting to level out over the last 9 and 12 months. Next slide, please. But one thing we're really interested in, as Eric mentioned, is do these rates, do these changes in alcohol use differ by various pre-COVID behavioral health disorders? So again, we did this by PTSD, we did this by depression and anxiety. We're only going to show PTSD because in fact, most of these results are almost nearly identical. And as you can see, the dark red line are actually individuals that screen positive for PTSD, and that dotted line are those that did not screen positive. Those that didn't screen positive, as you can see, they're decreasing their alcohol use, versus those that screen positive for PTSD are showing a slight increase during that first 6 to 9 months, and then sort of flattening off over that last year period. Now, one other really interesting thing that we wanted to look at in this study is, are there any behavioral health disparities that might exist in alcohol use? So we actually used a binary variable for men and women veterans, and also a racial ethnic minority variable for veterans, in predicting the same thing. And again, we're not going to show all these results because they're almost identical. And essentially what we show is both women and racial ethnic minority veterans show a very similar pattern as that dark red line, those with PTSD. They're starting at about the same rate pre-COVID, but they're showing slight increases and leveling off and staying higher on past 30-day alcohol use compared to their male counterparts and their white veteran counterparts. Next slide, please. Now, depression actually shows a little bit of a different story than alcohol use. It's really interesting. We're showing a significant increase in depression. I know it kind of looks like a step ladder, but the average increase in depression is significant from pre-COVID to 1 year post-COVID. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And one thing we wanted to do is look at how this may vary by pre-pandemic alcohol use disorder and cannabis use disorder. Now, the real only difference here is that pre-COVID, so those with alcohol use disorder are reporting higher rates of depression pre-COVID, but they're actually decreasing in their depression rates, but they do stay slightly higher. But you can see these rates are kind of paralleling each other. So while they do stay higher, the difference is really about only half a drink more. So in terms of depression across alcohol and cannabis use, the difference didn't actually show up as much as you saw there in the past 30-day alcohol use. However, for depression, we did show that women veterans and racial ethnic minority veterans started lower in depression, okay? But they actually showed an increase compared to their white and non-white veteran counterparts. So the male veterans and the non-white veterans showed a slight increase compared to their other counterparts. Next slide, please. So this is a really interesting study. A lot of folks are interested in loneliness during the pandemic. And loneliness, as you might imagine, is increasing because of our requirements to stay home, et cetera. And one thing we want to look at is, how does depression and loneliness interact with each other to predict alcohol use in the past week? And what this is simply showing is that dotted line are individuals that are reporting high loneliness, meaning higher than you normally would report. And all the way on the right, you can see that's a positive screen for depression on that x-axis, and on the left, we have a negative screen for depression. You'll note that there's really no difference based on loneliness or and drinks per week at negative depression screen, right? But as you move up to that positive depression screen, those that are reporting high loneliness are reporting quite a few drinks per week, more than those with low loneliness. In fact, you're looking at about a 4-drink difference during the past week. So while we don't know how meaningful this might be, because this is only a cross section, this is only a single time point of data, we are going to expand this to kind of start looking at how loneliness over the course of time influences alcohol use and behavioral health outcomes. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So these are our preliminary interview results. There's a lot of words on this slide. I'm not going to go over everything. I'm just going to sort of describe sort of how we came to do these interviews and sort of what we're seeing. I did quite a few of these interviews with our veterans, and the goal was to kind of look at how are they doing economically, how are they doing in their home life, how has the pandemic affected their mental health or social health, et cetera. And, you know, we got, as you might expect in interviews, we got a mixed bag of results. But in general, we saw a lot of resilience. Frankly, we were shocked to really hear a lot of stories of being able to spend more time with their family, being able to spend more time at home, doing projects, et cetera. We did see a lot of discussion around like missing family because they weren't able to see them, you know, missing kind of being out with friends, et cetera. But in general, we saw a lot of resilience, and we didn't see as much economic effect or financial effect. In fact, some of the veterans that I interviewed noted like, well, my job actually, I had to do more work. In fact, I'm more busy than I ever been because they were, you know, an essential worker, et cetera. While there are some that lost their job, but kind of really had a nice spin in terms of positive resilience in that. And we actually have a paper coming out on these interview results relatively soon. Next slide, please. So in general, we see that overall alcohol use is decreasing, which is contradictory to the prior research and sort of what's in the mass media right now. This is becoming more common of a story in the literature, whereas a lot of theory and a lot of people thought we were going to see these mass increases in substance use, these mass increases in mental health, but a lot of data right now are showing the opposite or relatively like no change whatsoever in some of these outcomes. The unfortunate thing is we are seeing disparities in those outcomes, meaning we're seeing disparities in alcohol use and we're seeing disparities in mental health by your pre-COVID disorder screening and also across women veterans and racial ethnic minority veterans. So this is something we're going to keep exploring as we move through the pandemic and sort of really start to unpack some of these things. Next slide, please. So we have a couple really, really cool studies that are sort of a follow-up. As Eric mentioned, we get to follow these veterans for another year. So we're going to have 2 full years of data to really look at sort of the long-term behavioral health effect of not just the pandemic, because we think some of those effects are going to fade relatively rapidly over the course of time. But this will actually be the first study of a non-VA sample to look at observational behavioral change, which is really exciting for us. The other thing we get to do is we get to use some of these results to create interventions. So that's something Eric and I do a lot of. We have quite a few grants that we are doing randomized controlled trials for veterans. So we have a grant that just got funded, Eric and I, with veterans to develop a mobile mindfulness app to address PTSD and multimorbid alcohol use disorder. We're kind of crossing our fingers that we get another grant to address comorbid PTSD and cannabis use disorder. But we're actually working with the National Center for PTSD and the San Francisco VA and the creator of mindfulness-based relapse prevention to develop this app. So we're actually able to deliver interventions, evidence-based interventions to veterans who are either unable to receive care at a VA, meaning they don't live very close. They don't want to receive care at a VA due to stigma associated with receiving care, or they don't have the opportunity to receive care. So we're really excited about that. The other thing we get to do is we're actually doing a brief alcohol intervention, totally separate grant for veterans. So we get to actually determine, can we develop an intervention that is delivered very briefly, about 30 minutes, and can we reduce alcohol use, in particular binge drinking, over the course of time? And if that's the case, this can be a very low cost, very accessible intervention for veterans either entering the VA or being delivered outside of the VA. I think that's about it. Next slide. Oh, well, that's it. Thanks so much for tuning in. That's Eric and I. That's our contact information. That's my email and Eric's email. Eric's got Twitter. I don't. But feel free to get a hold of us if you have any questions or comments or just want to chat. So we're willing to take questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, I've got one so far, Jordan, that I can take. So there was a question about, is there a reason for the disparities in your study between genders and race? Were there no Asians or Pacific Islanders in your study, for example? This is a great question. So when we had first designed this study, a lot of this had to do with just, can we actually find, veterans using these social media sites? And it was a way to prepare for this intervention study that we were then going to conduct. And so we put these ads out, and we have a bunch of checks on the back end to make sure that the people that respond are actually veterans and that they always say they are. But we kind of just put the survey out there and saw who responded. And so, we didn't necessarily say, if you're a white male veteran, this is a study for you, but that's who we ended up getting. Now, that is the majority of veterans. And so in terms of Asian and Pacific Islanders, I think we had about maybe 2% of the sample. But as Jordan mentioned, this is something that we realized is a pretty big limitation to the study. When we're able to do these analyses and actually finding, some differences between white and non-white, that's the best we can do, which isn't really that helpful. So we know that racial and ethnic minorities looks like they're different from whites in terms of how they're drinking and their mental health symptoms. So we definitely need to explore that more. So what we want to do now is use these methods that we've developed to try to recruit, maybe 50% white and then 50% racial and ethnic minorities for this larger study that we're going to look at, and then look and see how people are doing in terms of engagement and care, as well as their substance use and mental health issues.
Yeah, we're really excited about that project that we're hoping to submit a grant to do a very similar study that we just described here with larger majority of women and racial ethnic minority veterans to actually unpack a lot of those differences that we're seeing. Okay, I got a couple questions here. Let's see. Okay, a question about how will the mindfulness app work as an intervention? It's a great question. So I've been doing research on a specific intervention called MBRP, mindfulness-based relapse prevention, for about 7 years now. In fact, that was my dissertation. I just finished a small study here in LA with young adults with comorbid PTSD and substance use disorder. What we're doing is, so the app actually already exists for veterans. It's called Mindfulness Coach. In fact, it's the most downloaded app that has been developed by the National Center for PTSD. I think it's been downloaded over 500,000 times. So the National Center for PTSD, they're amazing to work with. They develop these interventions for veterans, but there's not a lot of science behind them. That's not their job. Their job is to develop tools that can help clinicians and help veterans. So we got money from NIAAA to not only test Mindfulness Coach, but we got a lot of feedback saying, well, if you just test Mindfulness Coach for PTSD, how are you going to deal with the large portion, as Eric mentioned, almost 60% of veterans with PTSD that have a multi-morbid substance use disorder? So what we're doing is we're actually integrating the sessions from mindfulness-based relapse prevention into the Mindfulness Coach so that it's all integrated. So each session that you get, which is about 14 sessions, you're going to be getting mindfulness-based relapse prevention content. And the idea is we're going to do a large randomized controlled trial where we deliver this intervention app to an experimental group, and we have a control condition, and we just follow them over time to determine feasibility, acceptability, long-term and short-term outcomes, and then hopefully, if things all work in our favor, regardless of the outcome of the actual app, we'll be able to write a much, much larger grant to do some more personalized intervention work with this piece. Eric, do you have another question?
Yep, I got two quick ones I can get through. So somebody asked, what is the study specifically California or across the United States? It's across the United States. We got veterans from all 50 states. And then, as I mentioned in the interviews, we've got them from 16 different states. I think that the follow-up study that we're going to do, again, we're going to try to do this, more national sample. Another one is the drinking per week data a recall statistic, or do you have other ways to collect information? At this point, yes, we ask people to recall their drinking behavior. People are pretty good at this. Self-report is actually really nicely comparable to other types of data collection for alcohol use. And in this survey, I mean, it's a confidential survey. There's no implications or no consequences if you report heavy use or if you underestimate your use. So we're hopefully pretty confident that the alcohol rates are pretty accurate.
Yeah. All right. I got a question. What are your thoughts about Zoom-based group interventions? Perhaps build it into the app or seeking safety? Well, it's a good question. In fact, there's another study that Eric and I didn't even talk about that we have starting up relatively soon. I'll mention that here in a second. The one potential, it's not a downfall, but it's something that Eric and I are pretty serious about doing, is we're trying to reach veterans who wouldn't normally seek care at a facility, whether or not it's because they don't want to be face-to-face with a clinician or have face-to-face contact with their peers. We don't know. I mean, there's a lot of research that Eric and I have done and a lot out there around stigma, around inability to access care. And we're pretty dead set on finding a way, whether or not this is it in terms of the app, we have no idea. We'll report back in a few years, but we're pretty dead set on finding ways to reach these populations that are unable to receive the care that their peers are receiving at a VA or peers are receiving at an outside VA clinic. We want to be able to find ways to deliver that to them. So a group-based intervention via Zoom could work, but it would be a bit of a different model than what Eric and I are trying to build off of, which is very accessible interventions for anyone that needs it. And this can also be an adjunct to people that are actually currently receiving care at a VA, but more so for those that are unable to receive care. Now, we actually have another really large study that's starting up in the fall. We're actually part of a 9-site randomized controlled trial testing a meditation. It's called Transcendental Meditation intervention for veterans with PTSD. In fact, it's going to be about a 600-person randomized controlled trial. Eric and I are site PIs for here in LA. And, we have no idea how this is going to sort itself out in terms of COVID-19, but we do have a backup plan to do sort of the group intervention portion. I think it's like 11 or it's 12 sessions. So that will probably be during over Zoom if we're not able to meet in person once we get this thing launched. So, it will probably be the first time that we're testing a third wave psychotherapy over Zoom. So we'll see how that sorts itself. Yeah.
Great. Okay, I've got one. Since the participants took the survey without expectation of being diagnosed with a mental health condition, how will you approach the veterans who screen positive and provide them with resources? Great question. So because this, it originally started as a one-time survey, we have, just as a social worker and a clinical psychologist, as well as IRB protocols for research, we just send everybody a list of resources. And we've actually, rather than just send them a couple of links, we've developed a 3-page PDF that we send them with some pretty neat links where they can, specific to where they live, click on a link that can get them, find a whole bunch of care sites for them near where they live. And so that's for the survey study. What we're doing with the intervention study, which is going to be the follow-up study to this, which we will start in a couple of months. We're designing the intervention now. And Jordan was just talking about, that's an intervention to actually help people get into another intervention. So it's this motivational tool or program that's, one, can hopefully help people reduce some of their drinking behaviors on their own, but then also maybe help facilitate them to actually seek more formal care. And so as part of that app, we're trying to develop some pretty unique resources where, it will be specific to the person. So rather than really having to more actively click on a link and find out where places are that you can go and get some treatment, we're hoping to just have that kind of automated on the website that we have based off of where the person lives.
All right, I don't have any more questions popping up. Do you, Eric? Oh, we got one more coming. Hold on. Will the next round of the study cover the same questions or topics, or will it differ in terms of what analytics you want to collect? I'm assuming this question is referring to the, cross our fingers, hope we get the money to do the next study with primarily women and racial ethnic minority veterans. I hope that's the case, so I'll answer it in that way. Yeah, we'll cover similar topics, but we're working with one of our really good buddies here at USC, Ricky Blumenthal. He's, just a brilliant human being and has done a lot of work around methamphetamine use and opioid use, but was really moving into a lot of disparities that exist across systems of care. And one thing we're going to really be focusing on in this next study, in this next grant we're writing, is discrimination as a whole. So yes, you have face-to-face discrimination, so racial, ethnic discrimination, but you also have physical barrier discrimination that we can utilize to understand barriers to care. So we can actually take data that we get from folks and we can geocode it, and we can look at the neighborhood around you. So we can look at facilities close to you. We can look at barriers in terms of alcohol outlets close to you, et cetera. And we can look at neighborhood level factors. We can look at individual level factors. And the really cool thing that we're also going to look at, this is near and dear to my heart because this is something that I study quite a bit, is violence exposure. So we're actually able to, if we have your data in terms of even just your zip code, we can determine in a certain radius, whatever you want it to be, a half mile, mile, 5 miles, we can count the number of reported events that occurred near you during the time that you took the survey. And we can actually look at how those concurrently affect your behavior. And this is great because across the country, every police department has to use FBI codes. So they're all the same across all departments. And we actually just finished a study doing a very similar thing for treatment outcomes. So our goal is to really look at, as a whole, a lot of sort of within person and between person and at like sort of the neighborhood level disparities that might exist across veterans to sort of influence and affect long-term behavioral health. Eric, do you have one?
Yeah, I've got one more. It's going to be the final question.
Okay.
I wanted to make one more point to that last one. If, the question was in reference to, the August, November, and February time point that we're going to continue doing. And we just ask the same questions every time. There's some modifications, but the reason that we ask the same questions is that then we're able to look at these trajectories over time. I mean, we keep thinking about things we want to add to the survey, and sometimes we'll drop a few things, but the main substance use and mental health issues we're just going to keep tracking. So those graphs that Jordan was showing, you'll be able to see 3 more time points this time next year. So then the last question was opioid abuse investigated, and what did we find? We asked about prescription opioids, we asked about heroin use, but we just had so few people that endorsed that, not just in the past 30 days, but even in the past year or in lifetime. So we decided not to look at that. Investigators in the past have kind of lumped everything into this other drug use category. And we thought about doing that, but it's also just really not that helpful when you lump a bunch of drugs that act in different ways in the body together. So we really were focused on alcohol and cannabis. We also have a lot of data. We also have a pretty heavy cigarette smoking sample, which is pretty interesting. So we're focused on tobacco and nicotine as well, which is actually, of all the drugs I've mentioned, the most used drug, nicotine is among veterans. So we're interested to look at some of those outcomes as well.
Yeah, Eric, we actually have one last one. this will be the last one. Eric, you might want to help me out on this too. This is a great question. I don't know the answer to it. Since loneliness was a contributing factor to past week alcohol use, what interventions would you suggest to address this? And I mean, that's the $1,000,000 question, right? In terms of what do you do to address sort of these lingering factors that are certainly going to remain for the foreseeable future because of the pandemic, but I think will likely alleviate over the course of the next year. I don't know. I don't know much about the loneliness literature, and frankly, I don't know a whole lot about interventions that would address that. Do you know anything about that, Eric?
Yeah, I would say that the interventions that help with depression, like behavioral activation, getting people to get out. And I think what happened with people that have depression and PTSD, I mean, in some ways, well, PTSD in particular, it's kind of like a relief to know that you don't have to go out and do stuff, or if you have social anxiety, to just knowing that. And to some extent, I know I felt this too, just to kind of get used to being home, and just going out to the grocery store feels like a massive task. Now it's like, imagine going to like a big party and socializing with people if that's not your thing to begin with. And so, with depression, I think you can really fall back into those patterns. So I think things like behavioral activation will really be helpful, but I think we're going to see, clinicians are going to have their work cut out for them, especially because we're seeing there's some, substance use to manage some of those loneliness and depression feelings. But, now that people are kind of set in their COVID ways, it's going to have to really push people to get out and engage, and, utilize the social supports that they have.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I didn't think about that. And something I forgot to mention in our presentation, which is our results are really pointing to some heavy lifting by clinicians coming up, when we're able to be in person. While we have a really cool paper coming out showing access to care via telehealth with veterans has increased substantially. So it's going to be a really cool paper coming out. But when we're back in person, given the trends that we're seeing, especially in behavioral health, I think some clinicians are really going to be bombarded with a lot of problems and a lot of lingering issues from this pandemic, specifically among veterans, but probably among the population as a whole as well.
Great. So I think we are wrapping up then. So we would just like to thank everybody for attending. We really appreciate the invitation and the ability to share some of these findings with you. We are in the process of writing a lot of this stuff up and getting it out there and getting it published. So we'd encourage you to kind of check out some of these published papers when you get a chance, but please, get in touch with either of us if you have any follow-up questions or any ideas for collaborations.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Conference features two prolific researchers focused on substance use and recovery in Latinx communities, both in the US and Mexico. Dr. Alvarado Valdez is the Cleophas and Victor Ramirez Professor of Practice, Policy, Research, and Advocacy for the Latino population at the USC Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work, and primarily focuses on the relationship between substance abuse, violence, and health issues among high-risk groups such as youth, prison gang members, sex workers, and aging drug users. Dr. Alice Cepeda is an assistant professor at the USC Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work, and her work focuses on the social epidemiology of drug use and the related health risks, behaviors that disproportionately affect urban Mexican origin minority populations, including violence, HIV infection risks, and mental health conditions. Please welcome Dr. Valdez and Dr. Cepeda.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. What we're going to do is a little bit different than the previous presentations. We'd like to introduce you to our program of research and how we frame our work and how we framed our work for the last few years. Primarily, as Nicole mentioned, our work has focused primarily on the socio-epidemiology of substance use and related health disparities among Latinos. We worked here in the United States among Latino populations. And for the last 10 years or so, we have also been working in Mexico. We have currently 2 studies. One study is funded by the National Institute of Minority Health Disparities, and it's an immigration study that's looking at a population of immigrants recently immigrated to LA in particular from Mexico, and a comparison group of immigrants that have recently deported back to Mexico and specifically into Mexico City. So this study focuses on, of course, a lot of the health disparities that result from this immigration process, but also on substance use. Our other study focuses is a follow-up study on female gang-associated persons who we first interviewed when they were 16 or 17 years old, and we've been able to follow up this population. Now they're approximately 35, 37 years old, also looking at issues related to health disparities and substance use. Our research demonstrates that drug dependency is largely related to health disparities and the impact of larger macro social factors on this population. And our work goes beyond kind of the person-centered focus that I think some of the other people have presented. For example, we think it's very important to recognize the impact that the war of drugs has had on underserved communities, especially racial and ethnic populations in the United States. This war on drugs, has resulted in very serious collateral consequences as implemented by the criminal justice system. In particular, a lot of our focus has been on the consequences of incarceration on individuals, their families, and their communities. And we argue that this war on drugs is largely responsible for kind of the disparities that exist and the consequences of substance use in these communities, and define it as a policy failure. So with those kinds of introduction remarks, I'll pass it on to my colleague, Dr. Cepeda.
Thank you, Abelardo. So I'm Alice Cepeda, and Abelardo and I have been working together for over 20 years on these issues, particularly as has been mentioned previously, among Latino populations. One of the things that's very unique, I think, to the work that we both do with our research teams is that the nature of our methodology and the nature of the populations that we work with. Specifically, our methodological approach tends to focus more on recruiting populations who are what we call hidden populations, vulnerable. They're not easily accessible. These are not populations of substance users who are currently in treatment or based out of community organizations. The work we do and the teams we have worked with focus more on recruiting populations who are out of treatment, who do not necessarily seek out and are not ready for any kind of services or treatment. So we do a lot of street-based recruitment. This means that we actually put our tennis shoes on and our jeans and we go out and recruit men and women in some of the hardest to reach geographic contexts, both in the US and in Mexico. So for instance, currently in our NIMHD research project, we are recruiting recently arrived immigrants in Los Angeles and recently returned either voluntarily or forced through deportations in Mexico City. And so this really requires a type of methodology that gets at identifying populations that normally go underrepresented in larger surveys across the US and in Mexico. This really gives us, I think, a lot of insight into kind of the nature of the epidemiological factors that are really kind of the basis to understand how to develop and create culturally tailored services, treatment, prevention for this population. So on that note, I think one of the things that we have really learned from a lot of our research is the fact that access to quality health care, treatment, and or any kind of recovery services for this population is typically not accessible for the populations that we work with. They're very inaccessible for many different reasons, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. So one of the things that we have really started to focus on within the last 5-6 years is focusing on kind of how do we provide access to healthcare and treatment that are what we would call kind of more low barrier services, and this includes harm reduction. I think this has in the past, it's been kind of a taboo term to use, but we're seeing it now more and more as something that is feasible and that we really need to start putting our money into understanding how effective evidence-based harm reduction services are. And this could include anything from syringe exchange programs to providing naloxone. More recently with the fentanyl epidemic, we are seeing now colleagues and research starting to focus on fentanyl test strips. So I think one of the most important things about the work that social workers and the work that public health researchers need to begin to address is to see drug dependence as a public health issue that may only be addressed for these vulnerable populations by incorporating more evidence-based harm reduction services. I want to bring to your attention, if you have not seen it, that recently the Biden-Harris team put out drug policy priorities, and enhancing evidence-based harm reduction services is one of the most important priorities for them among, a whole slew of them.
Yeah, and I think that just to add to that is it's very difficult to deal with drug dependency without taking into consideration, the context of where the drug use is occurring in the populations it's occurring, and to focus primarily on the individual, I think, was not necessarily the way that we should be thinking about this. And in particular for vulnerable populations, which drug users tend to get highly demonized and are not provided and given access to the kinds of services they need, and the larger context of where this actually occurs.
And I think, to start kind of wrapping it up, we have said this throughout the last couple of minutes, but I think we are moving towards this issue of racial equity and drug policy. The research that we do with Latino populations, and these are primarily Mexican origin populations, we kind of see the systemic inequities that just kind of perpetrate the disparities, and we're talking about disparities in terms of social, physical health that have been consistently evidenced in the last 3 to 4 decades, and so we as I think as public health researchers, we need to start focusing on how we actually operationalize that health equity in terms of drug policies and in terms of access to services. So I think with that, we will close, and we are more than happy to talk more in depth about the specific research projects that we currently are undertaking. So I think we can probably begin some of the Q&A. And we have a question in regards to health disparities between people immigrating to Los Angeles versus those being deported. And yeah, we could definitely talk a little bit about that.
Well, one of the big issues of deportation now, and many of you are probably aware that there's a huge number of people that are being deported. Just looking at the Mexican origin populations that we're seeing, large numbers of people who came to the United States with their parents, undocumented, and then because of a minor infraction, 25, 30 years later are deported. One of the major consequences of this, among many others, is we're seeing a lot of mental health issues. Many of these young people being deported don't speak the language, are unfamiliar with unfamiliar with kind of the social environment in which they find themselves in, and are relatively socially isolated. So we're seeing some really serious mental health issues with people going back and in this process of adaptation to a life which they were not familiar with. For immigrants that have been recent immigrants to the United States, again, we're seeing of the same sort of process, but probably a little bit more acute than in Mexico. We're seeing, again, mental health issues. We're seeing huge disparities as a result of the COVID epidemic, as we're all familiar with. It's impacted the immigrant community more than any other populations. And that continues to be some of the repercussions of this.
Yeah, and I think the previous presentation talked a little bit about the impact of COVID on their research study. And I think for us, it was very similar. We're right in the midst of collecting data. There was a halt at the height of this in both cities, in both countries. But one of the things we're really, starting to identify are two things. One is that the immigrants or the deportees who are returning to Mexico, we have a disproportionate amount of them who are being deported for nonviolent drug offenses. And again, this speaks to the policy failure of the war on drugs, where we're seeing young men and women who are being deported for, DUIs or having, small personal use of drugs, for instance, like marijuana on them. And number two, here in Los Angeles, we are seeing that there is an increase, for instance, in alcohol use among the population of recent immigrants. But it's I think our research is currently, like I said, we're less than halfway through this research project, but we're going to be able to document, I think, kind of the trajectory of substance use in terms of patterns of initiation. Did patterns of drug use initiate in the US, or did they initiate in Mexico? We are going to document patterns of increase use, and we're going to see patterns of desistance of drug use and cessation. So I think it's a very exciting time for our research project in terms of having access to this type of population and documenting the drug use patterns amongst the two groups. So there's a message, there's a question regarding what were some of the findings on the gang-affiliated group of women that you followed from age 16 to 30? So I think
I'll let Alice answer that.
Yeah, so I think one of the unique aspects of these two studies, because I just want to clarify that these were two cohorts of young men and women who we have been following up for over 10 years now. We interviewed them as adolescents, the young men who were street gang affiliated, and the young women who were affiliated tangentially, because this is again very unique. These were not gang involved women, but they were affiliated with gangs because of their relationships with the their male partners as boyfriends, cousins, brothers. And so for the young women who we have been following up for over 15, 20 years, we have seen kind of the cumulative and chronic trauma that many of them have been exposed to. We have approximately an average of 15 plus years of being in a violent intimate partner relationship during the course of their short lifespan. And we have seen also kind of the impact that has had on their physical and mental health status. One of the big findings, however, and this gets back to how we introduced kind of our work, is the fact that these young women, because of for instance, the fact that they use drugs, the fact that they're involved in the criminal justice system, there's a lot of hesitancy of engaging with any kind of institution, i.e. organizations that help potentially provide health services and or services for partner abuse. And much of this has to do with the fact of the negative experiences that they've had with the criminal justice system, with CPS, and the removal of their children from their home. So these are things that we are working on and trying to develop kind of more tailorized interventions for criminally involved women who don't seek out the help and the services related to their victimization of violence and partner relationships. And I think,
well, for men, one of the primary issues have been because they were quote gang members when they were younger. Many of them ended up being victimized by the criminal justice system with felonies at 17, 18 years old. And the result of these felonies is they were given access to public health, public housing, employment. That sort of cascaded, right? It's unfolded into a kind of a life which they weren't able to escape from. And given kind of these structural factors have resulted in these men, being very, very, very socially isolated from their families, from their children, and destitute. And many of them are at 35 and 40 years old, have very serious health problems, diabetes, high blood pressure, and other kinds of health issues, as well as some mental health issues, problems as well. So there's a really serious consequence, and it's sort of a hidden population. I would almost call them an underclass that we tend to overlook in our when we think of Hispanic populations, especially so.
And we have another question about how do you recruit immigrants for your research? Are some undocumented people worried about being caught by the authorities, and how do you build trust?
Great question.
That is a great question, and whoever asked it, we'd love to talk to you. So let's just, we're going to be honest here. It has been a challenge. It hasn't been a challenge in Mexico. We were more than halfway through our recruitment. And again, this has to do with the nature of the population, right? People who have returned voluntarily or been deported. But people here, right, as the person who asked this question have a lot to lose. Our research team are currently out on the streets. COVID really threw a wrench into all of this. And I guess pre-COVID, the anti-immigrant sentiment that was occurring with the previous administration also made it really hard for us to identify that population. We're currently using virtual methods because of COVID. We had to create Facebook pages and doing virtual interviews. And so that has been really difficult. Now that the city is starting to open up, we're now back kind of a little bit on track in terms of recruiting this population. But it's all word of mouth. It's building that trust, being in those certain communities day in and day out. And as we tell our research team, it's a matter of presence and visibility and developing the rapport that is needed for individuals in these particular circumstances to trust us as public health researchers. So it is a challenge, but we're working on that. What new policies do you want to see focused on racial equity in drug policy?
Well, one of the things, I mean, the primary thing is the decriminalization of drugs, and I think that we see the impact that the cannabis decriminalization has had on minority populations here in California and in other states. We think that there should be decriminalization of other drugs on a personal use level in any way. We think that that would have a major impact on their populations. I mean, and I think that would be, to me, one of the most important things. I think that we should also develop more of the harm reduction policies that we know work. They work in states in which they've been implemented, such as in Oregon, and we know they work in other countries like in Canada and Portugal, where harm reductions policies have reduced the consequences of drug use. Safe injection sites, needle exchange programs, just to name a couple of the harm reduction policies that I think should be implemented. But I really think that we should move away from dealing with substance use as a criminal issue, right, criminalization, and move it towards more public health view. And I think that you're seeing this in a sort of response to the opiate epidemic in the Northeast, where you're seeing it being approached much more from a public health perspective, and I think that's really kind of where we should be moving towards public policy.
And what have been the biggest challenges you have seen among these populations that contribute to their substance use? Again, we both agree that we really need to move beyond kind of going beyond the individual factors and really start focusing on these macro level socio-structural factors. I think one of the biggest things is that these populations are so marginalized and isolated and are, really in kind of in a state of despair. Everything from the fact that there has been loss of employment, incarceration has probably one of the biggest impacts, not on the individual, but as the family unit and the community unit. So I think those are definitely some of the biggest challenges of like how do we go beyond just individual treatment? We need to start talking about, again, what we rarely do, which is how do we do kind of more community-based, place-based interventions? Because, I think context matters. Rarely also do we talk about how drug use, people are using drugs. We're sitting in downtown LA right now, and I could probably bet you that across the street from us, there are individuals using drugs in a safe place in their homes and residences. But when you have individuals who are homeless, when you have individuals who are living in some of these kind of more impoverished communities and neighborhoods, they require themselves to go out, score on the street, use on the street. And so that's where I think the biggest issues occur in terms of, safe haven and context in terms of these populations. So I think those are things we really need to start talking about these types of issues in these kinds of settings and in these kinds of venues. Have another question. How has Latinx culture on mental health and rehabilitation affected your research? How has Latinx culture on mental health and rehab affected your research?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not really sure that I could answer that question directly. I would just say that when we think of programs, we think of drug interventions or drug prevention strategies to use in Latinx communities. Culture becomes a really important factor that needs to be considered. We know that in these Latino communities, family, is a very important institution. The families are generally very understanding, forgiven of individuals in those families that are possibly abusing substances. And so any kind of a treatment model that we develop, I would say needs to take in, be treated not sort of at the individual, but more at the family level. And, we know that there are some programs that are being developed, for instance, at the University of Miami by Dr. Daniel Santisteban, who has a kind of very effective intervention it's tailored to Latino populations and then tailored to the family situation itself. So I think that's the kind of approach that we should be having. I do not think that like one approach, right, fits everyone, regardless of their ethnicity, their race, or their economic status. It has to be adopted to that particular community. So I think that's a great question, and it's really a challenge for us as researchers to really come up with culturally relevant mental health and rehabilitation programs for these populations.
Mm-hmm. And we have another question about, have you all done any research for populations that are temporary migrant workers, i.e. Mexican fruit workers? That's also a very good question. The focus of the current NIMH study was focused more on urban populations. So floating populations between large urban centers. And so we were not focused on kind of more of the agricultural workers. However, because of COVID, we began to examine the impact COVID has had on essential workers here in Los Angeles. We are working towards putting together, submitting an application to NIH that focuses on essential workers that include a disproportionate population of agricultural workers. And so that's currently something that we're working on, but we have not worked with that population as of today. but we intend to hopefully focus on that. What role has technology played in the health outcomes in the female gang-associated people you have tracked over the past 20 years? You know, so we're running out of time, but I would like to say that for the women, the technology pre-COVID was very, very important in terms of recruitment. So we had to relocate and recruit and re-interview these young women after we hadn't seen them, you know, since they were adolescents. And many of these young women were on Facebook. And so that really helped our recruitment purposes. Now, currently, during this COVID kind of shutdown that we had and the halt in our research, it became a little difficult, especially given the sensitive nature of our research focused on intimate partner violence, to be able to do virtual interviews when the women were at home with family, with partners. And so contrary to what other colleagues of ours have had in terms of the success of doing virtual interviewing, I think we had a much harder time given the sensitive nature of the population. But technology was a big factor in terms of our recruitment purposes. I hope that answered the question, I think.
Yeah, I would just like one last thought. I think that we need to move away from demonizing drug users. We tend to think that using drugs is really the major issue in their lives, and actually, if they're using drugs for a lot of different factors, and I think that those are really the precursors to the substance use. And I think that we need to kind of refocus, reframe our sort of view of drug users and move away from demonizing them. And I think that's kind of the first step for us as a social work profession, and start treating them in a more humane way. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cepeda and Dr. Valdez, for your important research and for speaking with us today. We really appreciate it. That concludes the presentations portion of the Next Generation Social Work Conference. I want to thank all of our guest speakers for their wonderful presentations, and I hope you have learned a bit more about how social work is advancing research and practice in addiction science. Please join us now for our Meet the Schools Fair on the Brazen platform, where you can interact with 23 schools of social work around the country to learn more about their MSW programs. Thank you for joining us.